Hello, dear viewers. Support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it. And also, make sure you comment your thoughts. Now let's start the video. King's Landing 306 AC. Davos. He stood and looked out the window of his solar. The sun was just rising, and he knew that meant that he had another long day ahead of him. Though he was looking west instead of east, it was to the east where his thoughts were as he wondered how his king, queen, and princess were doing, and tried not to think how much he missed their presence. With a last look at the rising sun, Davos turned and made his way to break his fast, and to have his walk. It was his usual morning routine, or to be more precise, it had become so. Wake, stare out the window, eat and then walk around the Red Keep and ponder the day and the problems ahead. His two northern guards waited for him as he left the room. Both of them knew his routine as well as he did, and it had taken him some time to get them to eat with him when he broke his fast. He'd waved off their concerns about his safety as they did so, telling them that if someone wished him dead while he ate his bacon and eggs, then perhaps it was time for him to go to his gods. So over time, they'd relaxed, and he very much enjoyed the morning conversation with them both. Almost as much as he enjoyed the walk he took. The one moment in the day where he could be truly alone with his thoughts, even though he was not ever truly alone, other than when he was in his bed. After eating and taking his walk, Davos made his way to the throne room and then to the rooms behind it. Some had said he should stay in the royal chambers, but Davos had refused to even contemplate such a thing. He conceded that he'd use what should be the king or queen's solar, but that was his only concession. Hand and acting regent. He may be, king he was not, and he had too much faith in the king and queen. He served to allow anyone to even consider that for even a moment. Lord Varys, he said, as he walked to the solar. The Master of Whisperers already waiting outside for him, which meant he had news from the east. Lord Yan, Varys said with a small bow. They both entered the room, and he sent out for water as neither the eunuch nor he were big wine drinkers, and certainly not this early in the morning. Taking his seat, he bid Varys do likewise, and then he tried not to look too eager for whatever news he brought with him. He'd found he quite liked the man, something that if you'd told him years or even but a year earlier, he'd have laughed at you for saying. Varys, though, was not who he had thought him to be. The man cared about the people, and wished to make their lives better, and since that was what his king and queen had tasked him to do, Davos was more than happy to name the man an ally, if not yet a friend. Our king and queen have added 2 more cities to their empire. Braavos has knelt and pledged itself to them both, and Meereen is once again a free city. Varys said, and Davos smiled a smile which was only to grow bigger a moment later. Ships have been sent from Braavos to the north, and some to ourselves. They carry food and supplies to add to our own. Varys said, and Davos almost fell the need for wine, such was his relief. Food was greatly needed, and not just in the north. Cersei Lannister had taken most of the Reach's winter supply for herself, and was that not bad enough? She'd then wasted a lot of it. Davos had almost cried in frustration when he'd seen how badly stored it had been. Winter hadn't come on them too hard, and before they left, both Lady Kinvara and Lady Melora had said to him that it would not do so because of the death of the Night King. So they had at least been able to plant more crops, and in time they'd have another harvest. In time, but not now. So despite hoping to make people's lives better, one of the first tasks he'd had as hand was in essence to make them a little worse, food being rationed out instead of freely available, and though he knew in his heart that the people in Flea Bottom were actually better off, it didn't stop him from feeling guilty that he could not give them more. If there were supplies starting to come from Essos, and if those supplies were regular, then perhaps soon he could. Was anyone hurt? When they took Meereen, did we lose anyone? He asked, worriedly, knowing that, had the king, queen, or princess been harmed, then Varys would have already made that clear. No, it was taken quite easily. Varys said almost proudly, and Davos breathed a relieved sigh for those others in the king and queen's company that he'd become close to. Where do they intend to go next? He asked curiously. I'm not certain, perhaps. Yunkai and Astapor, Varys said before looking at him. There was one other piece of news, one most curious, and one, I'm happy to say, that it shocked in me. Things shock you, Davos said with a chuckle that Varys joined in with. Not often, I'll admit, but then again, how often does one hear news such as this? Rhaenys Targaryen is alive, Davos. Alive and by our king and queen's side. Varys said, and Davos shook his head as he looked at Varys, almost expecting to hear the punchline to some jape. How? He asked, the one clear thought that he could bring himself to speak aloud. I know not the details. Only that she is alive and by their side, Varys said, sounding perplexed for once. Can we be sure it's her? He asked, and Varys smiled. On that we can be certain. It seems there are now 4 dragons in the world. Davos, Princess Rhaenys is soon to be a dragon rider too. Dragon rider to a dragon hatched by our king. Varys said, smiling still. The small council meeting that day turned out a far happier affair as he told them about the news of the campaign in the east, all of them including Lord Davin Lannister, who had accepted the role of Master of Laws on a temporary basis while Jon Connington was with the king, and Sir Halber Redwine, who had agreed to sit his father's seat while he sailed with the royal fleet, were relieved to hear they'd suffered no casualties. When he told them the news of the food shipment, Davos could see the relief that each of them felt clearly in their eyes. While the major shortage was here in King's Landing, deliveries from each of the 7 kingdoms were now far lesser than they'd ever been. Every region needed more. In time, he hoped that they'd be back to how it was before the wars, and he'd then ensure that it went beyond that and to a time that few could remember. How long it would take to get to that point had just been shortened, and he was relieved greatly by this. There were still many issues to discuss, and coin was once again a large problem, and would soon be a larger one, or so he thought, until Varys spoke. They forgave the debt? Lady Anya asked incredulously. Forgive me, Lord Hand, in discussing other things I'd forgotten to bring this up. Varys said, looking to him, and Davos shook his head to say there was nothing to forgive. The Iron Bank was persuaded by our queen, from what my little birds tell me. She spoke very vociferously. Varys said with a smirk on his face. Thank the gods for Queen Daenerys, Lady Anya said, her relief and gratitude clear. How much does this help us? Sorb asked. Without the Iron Bank's interest payments or the debt itself, greatly, Lady Anya said. We've begun to collect our taxes again, and all but Storm's End have been forthcoming, she added before looking to him. We'll discuss coin at a later date. Lord Vierks, when can we expect of the ships? From Braavos he asked, changing the subject. Within the week, Lord Varys said, as Davos scratched his chin. His beard needed a good trimming, and he'd left it far too long. Sir Halber, make sure the old Tyrell warehouse has been properly cleaned out. Take some people from Flea Bottom and gave them extra rations for the work. As you say, Lord Hand. That'll be all for now, Lord Varys, Lady Anya. Please wait a moment. He waited until Lord Davin and Sir Halber had left, and once they had, he then poured himself a mug of water, Lady Anya taking a glass of wine while Varys refused either. What is that fool playing at? He asked, not needing to speak Edric's name aloud. I don't know, Davos. His letter suggests that Lord Stannis cleaned out the treasury, which you yourself confirmed, but we know that he's since collected taxes himself. Lady Anya said. Varys? He asked, and Varys shook his head. I've not got one of my little birds close enough to him yet. Perhaps he's testing the crown with their graces. Not here, or perhaps he's speaking the truth somewhat. For now, I can't be certain which. Varys said, and Davos could see the man's annoyance at himself. Be certain, he said, and Varys nodded. And should it be the former? Lady Anya asked. Then he'll be given but one warning, and the next one won't come from me, but will come from a dragon. Davos said, hoping that it would not come to that, but willing, if need be, to send for the king or queen. The ships arrived 2 days later, and they were even more bountiful than he'd dared to hope for. Davos having to get Sir Halber to open up another building to store the food, and then being told that the North had received just as much as they. Finding coin to be a part of the shipment was an even bigger boon, and he knew that Lady Anya would put it to great use. It was the letter, though, that he felt was the biggest boon of all, and later that night, after he'd read it, he stood by the window once more. Sentimental sod, he said, smiling, as he thought on the king's words. The Black Wind 306 AC. Diario. Of all the ships and all the companions that he'd expected to sail on and with, the Ironborn would have perhaps been his last choice, were it not for the fact that he'd made his peace with the king and had been accepted back into the fold by the queen. Then he'd think he was being punished somehow. He was not, the 10 Unsullied and 10 Dothraki that he had under his command, and the fact that this was the swiftest of all the ships in the fleet proved that, as did the mission that he'd been tasked to complete. Even if it was just to scout the lands between where most of the fleet was to land and Korth itself. His first couple of nights on this ship had been dull and uninteresting. The young Ironborn was practically an Unsullied himself and was certainly as miserable as they could be at times. His sister was more of a man than he, and even dressed like one. Other than for the drink, which flowed freely, Dario felt that this would be one of the longest journeys of his life, or he did, until he found himself not quite drunk and yet not sober, and being pushed against a wall by Yara Greyjoy. Lemon begins, "Let me see that cock of yours. If it's as big as your mouth, I may let you stick me with it," Yara said as she began to undo his breeches. "What makes you think I want to stick it in you?" he said, and though he meant the words, he only half meant them. It was a dull and boring journey after all. "The fact that this is hard," Yara said, as she wrapped her hand around his cock. "It's always hard, don't flatter yourself," he said with a half smirk. I'm sure it is, but right now it's hard for me," she whispered in his ear, as she bit down less than gently on it. "Careful, girl, I can play rough too," he said, as he grabbed her by the throat. "Thank fuck for that," she said as she smiled, and for the first time he looked at her and he saw that she was actually far prettier than he had thought. This was only reinforced when she moved to the bed and began to take off her clothes, Yara revealing a body that had been hidden away and one that truly deserved to be seen and to be enjoyed. He moved closer to the bed and watched as she spread her legs a little, her hand going between them as he removed his own clothes so quickly that he tore his shirt, something that pleased given the faster movements of her hand. When he began to kiss her and tried to slip himself between her legs, she closed them, her hands taking his head between them and moving them from her face to her neck and chest, and making her meaning clear. It was not something he normally did, his own pleasure meaning far more to him usually than whatever woman he laid with. There was something about her eyes and the way she looked at him, though, and it took him a moment to see the challenge in them, a challenge that he felt the need to accept and master. When he bit down on her nipple, she pulled his hair tightly and forced him away from it, Dario smiling as she moved him to her other breast. He heard her sharp intake of breath as he kissed her stomach and licked around her belly button, before again he felt her hands on his head as she pushed him down lower. Yara had dark hair around her sex, hair that had been trimmed and was now damp to the touch. Using his fingers, he softly stroked that hair before moving them between her legs, and with a feather-light touch, he stroked and felt the source of that wetness. "By the drowned god, use your damn tongue already," Yara said after he'd teased her for a while, and whether it was the look she wore on her face or his own desire to please her, he did as she bid. She tasted of the sea, or as close to it as he could name what it was that her particular taste reminded him of. He found himself enjoying the little shakes and quivers she made each time his tongue passed over her nub before it continued its journey downward and then began an even slower journey back up again. Dario drew it out, moving quicker one way than the other, building up her frustration and tension until she grabbed his head once more and directed him where she wished him to be. Once she did, he wasted no time. He licked, bit down, ever so gently on, blew cold air against, and moved her nub from side to side with first his tongue and then his finger. When he then slipped the first of his now wet fingers inside her, she arched her back, and when he added another, the sound of her moan would and should wake the rest of the ship. That sound only grew louder as he brought her to the brink and he saw her raise up on her elbows so that she could see him. A look of hunger and desire in her eyes that did wonders for that ego she had claimed he had. "Time to fall," he said softly, and he saw how her nostrils flared before he took her nub between his lips and sucked and then pushed his fingers a little deeper inside of her. Yara wailed. She actually wailed like a creature of the sea, and only that her thighs gripped him tightly and cut off all sounds, or he'd have known just how long that wail went on for. Eventually she relaxed, her grip loosened, and he kissed her softly between the legs, and then he felt her shudder as he moved his way back up her body. She kissed him deeply when he reached her face. The taste of her was on his tongue, lips, and even his chin, and she kissed, licked, and reveled in tasting herself. "I had thought you'd be all show," she said with a smile. "And I had thought you a man," he said honestly. "Then what I'm about to do to you makes you a very different type of man, then, doesn't it?" she said as she rolled on top of him and began to kiss down his body, her lips, her tongue, and her teeth all leaving their marks as she did so. It would have made him a much different type of man indeed, he thought as he drifted off to sleep with her in his arms later that night. A very different type for a very different type of woman. Lemon ends. Each night they sailed, since had found him in Yara's bed. Dario soon finding her to be almost two different people. Outside of her cabin, she was a hard and fierce woman. A sailor, reaver, as crass and crude as any man on the ship, and twice as dangerous as most of them. In her room, she was never sweet and gentle, never a lady, but she was always a woman. They would lay together and talk afterward, Yara telling him tales of the Iron Islands and the things she'd seen while at sea, while Dario told of his adventures with the Second Sons. The only thing that they didn't speak of was Daenerys, Dario making the mistake of doing so one night and finding himself sleeping alone because of it. At first he thought it was Yara's own loyalty to the Queen, something that was without doubt. Then he realized it was that she didn't wish to hear him speak of Daenerys because of what he had shared with her and was now sharing with Yara. Not just his time in the bedroom, but more than that, so much more than that. "You're the only one I wish to lay with, now and in the future." He told her that last night and had meant it completely. His time with Daenerys was in the past, and not only did she not want him that way, but Daenerys had begun to realize over time that he no longer wanted her that way either. Partly that was because he'd found that he actually liked the man that she was with now. Partly it was because he wished for his life to be more than what it was before, as he looked and saw Yara point to the land ahead of them, and wearing a small smirk on her face. When she saw him looking at her, he knew that part, and perhaps the largest part of all, was that he'd found another queen to serve. Married the Dragon's Wrath, 3006 AC. Rosier. The arguments had been long and loud, and she'd been fighting alone for all of them. Neither Generale Dany, Missandei, or Jon had taken her part. Other than Tormund and Kono, not one of them did, and she was grateful for Tormund's support, if not for the way he spoke that support. Erige hadn't been compared to a Dothrak woman giving birth on a horse, though at least it gave her something to work with and something to argue back. She knew they only wanted what was best for her, and that they were worried, given how close she was to birthing her babe. There were even times when she had considered staying back in Meereen while they sailed on to Korth. It was more the amount of time that they'd be parted that she couldn't accept. Even at the risk to her or her babe, she just couldn't accept that she'd not see them for moons on end. The thoughts that Jon wouldn't hold his niece or nephew in his arms and that her child would not be close to their cousin while Rosiel slept in her crib were too much for her to bear, and so bear them she would not. So she'd not listened, argued, had fallen out with Gendry and Jon most of all, as Dany and Missandei had eventually come around. Gendry too, as the day neared when they would be departing. Meereen drew close to Jon, though he could and was as stubborn as she, and each time they were in the same room together, then the arguments would start once more. More times than she could count, they'd ended with her storming from the room and telling him how much she hated him, only to later cry for what felt like hours on end as she said over and over that she hadn't meant it, and that she loved him for true. It was the visit from Rhaenys that told her what the true issue was, that while yes, he was worried about her and the babe she carried, it was far more than that. Axlia listening as she was told of the fight to come, and how even that paled in Jon's mind compared to what he thought when he looked at her and saw her grow ever closer to giving birth. Her words made her search him out, and she found him with Rhaella as they sat out on the balcony and spoke to Leorax. "Yen, can we talk?" she said softly as she moved to him, and she saw his small frown as he looked from her to Rhaella in his arms. I'm not her, Jon. It's not the same," she said, as she sat down beside them both, and he looked at her with so much worry in his expression that she leaned forward and kissed his cheek. "I know what you fear, gods, I fear it too. It'd be the same if I was here, though. The same, but worse as well. You'd be safe. There are healers, and I'd be alone, Jon. My family would be elsewhere. I'd be alone, and I can't be alone." As she felt the tears come, and they annoyed and frustrated her. Ajay, his arm went around her, and he held her with one arm while he held Rhaena with the other. Only one of them crying, and to her shame, it wasn't the babe. She didn't hear the words he spoke to her. Just felt they were comforting, and she welcomed them because of that. Not until she had stopped crying did he let her go, and when he did, he wiped her tears away with his hand as he looked at her and nodded. "You sail with us on our ship, and you do what you're told, Arya. Promise me that, and I'll say no more on it," he said determinedly. I promise. Thank you, Jon," she said happily, the smile making the tears fade away. They set sail the next day, and Jon had a number of healers and 2 Dothraki women with experience in birthing children all placed close to her. He also made sure that Lady Kinvara was on this ship and not another, which she found strange but cared not about. All that mattered to her was that she wasn't being left behind, and she wouldn't be alone. The sickness of the sea came upon her hard, which meant that both Jon and Gendry were even more worried about her, and then even more protective. She tried to tell them both she was well, that there was nothing for them to worry about, and that she still had more than a moon to go, until the babe would be even close to being birthed. She tried to no avail. Her husband and her brother confined her to her bed, both of them deciding that they knew better than she, and when she went to argue, Jon just looked at her, and so she held her tongue. It turned out to be for the best, as within a day or two she began feeling better, and just as they gave her leave to finally get out of her bed, the pains began. In her life she'd been beaten, cut, bled, and almost worse, and yet the pain she felt as her time drew close was unlike any she had ever felt before. She cried out and begged the gods for respite in one breath before cursing them in another. Yet the pains persisted, and if anything, they soon grew even worse. "The babe is coming. It's to be tonight or early on the morrow," one of the Dothraki women said to Dany, and Arya felt annoyed with herself that she couldn't remember the woman's name. "And Aery?" Dany asked the woman as Aery listened or tried to. "Is as strong as any mother could hope to be, Khaleesi," the woman said with what looked to be a smile on her face, though Arya couldn't see it clearly. "Thank you, Wethy," Dany said, before moving to sit in the chair beside the bed. "Where's Rhaella?" Arya asked as Dany reached out to take her hand. "With Missy. I know this hurts. Arya, I'd like to be able to tell you that the pain will go away. It will, but not for some time. If it gets too much, we can give you something. But it's better if you bear it," Dany said. "Was it for you, was it?" she asked worriedly. "The very same, and I feared as you fear now. But you've seen Rhaella, and she was worth a little pain, just as your own babe will be." Dany seemed squeezing her hand. "Gendry, Jon, I need to speak to them," Arya said, almost panicked. "I'll fetch them. All will be well. Arya, trust me," Dany said reassuringly. Her husband and brother arrived a few moments later, and she looked at them both. Each of them was as worried and concerned as the other, though Jon seemed perhaps slightly the worst of the two. Rosier's words about his own mother seeming truer now. She'd asked why he'd not felt that way about Dagrir, and Rosier told her that he more than likely had. But with her, he had more time to think that way, and so, in some ways, it was worse. "Should? If I don't," she said shakily. You will? You will? Don't say that," Gendry said, his anger a front for his fear. "If I do, both of you need to look after the babe. Both of you. Promise me, Jon. Promise me," she said, the words coming out of her almost in a burst. "I promise, little sister, I promise that I'll be the truest uncle to my niece or nephew, that I'll see them play with my daughter, and that they, their father and their mother, will have many days together. I promise that they will grow up with the love of both their parents, and they'll know it each time they look into their mother and father's eyes." Jon said, his voice as firm as if he was giving her an edict or command. "Jon! No, Arya. You will be well, the babe will be well, and there's only one thing we say to anyone who dares to say otherwise," Jon said as he moved to the bed. "What do we say?" he asked her as he took her hand and looked deep into her eyes. "Not today," she said softly. "Not today," he said as he kissed her cheek. When she cried out in pain once more, they were ushered from the room, and the Dothraki women rushed inside. She felt them as they cleaned her between her legs, as they wiped her brow and spoke to her. And then she felt her eyes begin to close, and her vision cloud over. The voices in the room became muted, and the room she was in was no longer the cabin on the ship. It was the great hall in Winterfell, and she looked around to see almost all of her family were there. "I told you not to feed Shaggy Dog from the table, Rickon," her mother's voice said as Arya turned to see her standing there and looking as she had always looked to her. "Sorry, Mother," Rickon said. Her brother was older and taller, and yet the same as he ever was. "Gruan, no more climbing. I'll not say it again," her mother said, as Arya looked to see her other brother walk to the table before taking his seat. "Robb, we'll need to visit Cerwyn today," her father said, and Arya felt her tears fall as she looked to her father and her brother, both of them looking just how they had when she had last seen them. And as they began to fade away, she didn't wish to leave. "Father, please," she shouted. "Your place is not with us, little wolf. Not today." Her father said, the smile on his face, the same one he wore when she had hit the target on that day so long ago. When she opened her eyes, the pain was gone. She felt clear-headed, and she looked to see Ithie hand her the babe. "Your son is as healthy as a babe can be, his mother too," Ithie said, and Arya took a hold of the precious bundle that was her son. "My husband, brother, and Dany," she said, barely able to get the words out. "We'll be told and allowed in if that's your wish," Ithie asked, and Arya nodded. She looked at her son. His eyes were a bright blue, his hair so very dark, and he looked so very much like his father that it brought a smile to her face. as it did when he grabbed her finger with his hand and tried to pull it to his mouth. As she looked at him, she felt him almost cry out in her head, as if he was telling her what and who he was, and she knew then what his name would be. Argyr heard the door open, and she looked from up her son to see Jon, Dany, and Gendry enter the room, her husband moving over to her and then reaching down to touch their son. "Robb, his name is Robb," she said happily, and she looked to see the beaming smile that Jon wore on his face, as he and Dany moved closer to see their nephew for the first time. Wintertown 3006 AC. Sansa. Over the past few moons, her life had become a routine, a horrible and pathetic routine. Each day her food would arrive, and each week she'd be given her coin. At first, they'd given her enough to purchase food herself. But the people of Wintertown had refused to sell to her, or had charged her prices that she couldn't afford. A week had gone by where she'd barely eaten, and so she'd been forced to go to Winterfell and beg for their help. They'd not allowed her past the gates, and she feared that she'd be sent away with nothing to show from the trek from Wintertown. Then the man who now ran her family keep and who had served with Jon in Castle Black had come to speak to her personally. She'd met the man when she had gone to Castle Black, and he'd been sweet enough, even though he was still and had been incredibly dull. So she'd tried to play upon his sympathies and had asked for her room to be moved back into the keep. Sansa playing up the hatred and scorn that she got from the people in Wintertown, and adding in that she feared for her safety while there. None of it had worked. And a man she now remembered as never smiling in all the time she'd seen him, had then laughed loudly upon hearing her words. "You're good, and by the gods were this moons ago then, I'd have fallen for those pretty words of yours. I've seen the truth of you, though, heard it, and it's not just my men who've been watching every move you make. What you said about the princess, you think I'd not hear about that," Dolorous Ed said to her with a smirk on his face. "I was angry and upset, I didn't mean it," she said as she willed her tears to come. "I doubt other than angry that any of those words you've just spoken are true. The men will escort you back, and they'll see you're given food, water, and some material for clothing. You'll receive a delivery each day from now on, and the difference will be taken from your own coin," he said, as he turned. "You're cutting my allowance?" she asked, horrified. "Your allowance is for you to live on, since I'm now supplying most of your food and clothing. You don't need as much, and we wouldn't want you to have more than you need now, would we?" Over time, she'd thought they'd forget her words, or remember who she truly was. These people owed their lives to what she had done, and even before that they owed their allegiance to her house above any, even above a king and queen. Yet they seemed to care not that was it. Not for her, they'd have been left to suffer under Bolton rule, or forced to endure the rule of a wrathful dragon bitch. Something that somehow had not yet come to pass, and which had made her now more certain that time was not her friend. Sansa had been sure that given enough time on the throne, then the truth of Daenerys Targaryen would shine through. Her true nature and true intent would eventually be made clear, and once it had, they'd turn to her because she'd known and warned them of what was to come. At night she'd lay alone in her small bed and pray to the mother to show these fools the truth of the dragon bitch and the bastard. Then each day would be the same as the one before, and all that she'd hoped and prayed for would turn out to be nothing more than a silly dream. She was sure that food supplies would grow short without her there to manage them, and that once people felt the hunger in their bellies, then the truth of things would be revealed. Only to find that even in that the gods were not on her side. When her own food delivery arrived, it made her think that finally things were turning her way and that they were starting to see just how important she was. Only for the truth of things to take away another piece of the hope that she carried within her. The hope that in time Daenerys Targaryen would be made to walk in her shoes and Jon Snow would be shown for what he was, while she would finally be crowned and giving what was hers by right. "What's this?" she asked, looking to the basket that the guard had brought to her door. "Your delivery," the guard sneered. "It's larger, is there? Will there be no delivery on the morrow?" she asked worriedly, as larger though the basket was. It wasn't enough for 2 days, at least she didn't believe it was. "There will be a delivery on the morrow," the guard said as he handed her the basket. There was a time when she'd get excited about her name day, or when her mother or father had that glint in their eyes that told them they were gifting her a present for some good deed that she'd done. When she'd excelled in her embroidery, or when Septim Ordain had spoken her praises, or sometimes when her mother and father just wished to see her smile. Some days she'd get excited when she knew they were having lemon cakes, or when she knew they were to receive visitors. Over time, the things that excited her changed and became more personal victories, as she had waited for the dragon bitch and her bastard brother to arrive on that day that now felt like an age ago. Sansa had been excited by the game she had been set to play and the victory that would and should have been hers. "How has it come to this?" she asked as she opened the basket and tried not to dwell on the thoughts that she was excited by what she may find inside. The peach was juicy, and she ate it as far from ladylike as possible. Its juices rolled down her chin, and she cared not. Just the mere taste of it in her mouth was enough to rob her of all her manners and dignity. When she saw the small lemon tart, she almost drooled, such was her eagerness to taste such a thing once again. Gods knew how long it had been since she'd tasted a dessert, or eaten something that wasn't just for sustenance. "I'll save you for later," she said almost giddily as she put the tart to one side. Her meal that night was one of the best she'd had in a long time, even better than some she'd had while Lady of Winterfell, as her appetite there had never truly returned to what it had once been. The memories of the things that Ramsay had done to her in her family home were not conducive to enjoying eating in that same home. If anything, she perhaps drank wine, more so than she had eaten when she was in charge of the keep. Over the next few days when her food was delivered, she was again that giddy, excitable girl she had once been. Each time, to her delight, she'd find a piece of fruit and a tart of some sort. Even though they were not always lemon, she welcomed them all the same. And she was sure that it was because they were starting to see the error in the way they'd treated her. It was only when the day that she was to receive her allowance arrived that she began to suspect that something else was going on. Sansa surprised to find no change in it at all, and it was that which led her outside of her room for the first time in moons. What she found and heard as she walked around the town was enough to almost crush that little bit of hope for good. The food she had been so enjoying, the extra little treats, and fuller supplies, were not something that she alone was receiving. They were not some sign that people had seen the error of their ways. The truth of them was far simpler and far more hurtful to both her and to her cause. The king and queen sent ships to White Harbor and to Deepwood Motta and Bear Island. Saw the carts arrive at Winterfell myself. Hundreds of them there were. I knew they'd see us through winter. To the king and queen. Hail to King Aegon and Queen Daenerys. Hail to the dragons. The words were like arrows to her heart, and she hurried back to her room, hoping that she had remained unseen. In this at least, she was lucky, as the scorn and vitriol that she would face from these people would only be worse now. She sat down on her bed and let her tears fall as she began to face up to the fact that time was not going to bring her back. What she had lost, nothing was. This was the life she was to live from now on, and it was a life that she hated with all that she was. Court 3006 AC. Rosiers. Were it not for the fact that she couldn't go flying with her brother, then she'd have found the journey to Course to be the happiest time of her life. Being on the ship with Aegon and Dany, and spending time with Rhaella was more than she ever hoped it could be. She had a family, a true family, and her brother, when he was with her, was completely different than he was with most other people, other than Dany and Rhaella, or to her surprise, Tormund Giantsbane. Even when he was with Arya, he was different, more on edge and restrained, though perhaps that had been more to do with his worries over her being with child. With Dany and Rhaella, he was more relaxed. He laughed more, and at times he could be incredibly silly. It was the same with Tormund Giantsbane, the large man seeming to have a way to make his irreverence seem normal and much appreciated by Aegon. For her, though it was the times when they spoke, the tales they shared about their childhood that were both good and bad, Aegon would hold her hand, and she had never known how much she actually needed the feel of another person doing so. Especially someone she knew who loved and cared for her as much as her brother already did. They both spoke of how different their lives could have been, even though this was the only life they could have had. Then one day, as they sat on deck together just before they reached court itself, Aegon finally asked her what would have happened to her in that other life as he told her about what he'd done and why. "I killed her. For them. For all of them." Aegon said softly, "I let them into my head and saw what they saw and then spent the rest of my life behind the wall trying to die." "It was not the life you were supposed to lead," she said as he squeezed her hand. "I know, I understand that. What I can't understand is why didn't the god intervene then? Why didn't they show me the truth then? What happened to you, Rosier? What happened to you?" he asked worriedly. "I died, everyone died. I just died sooner than most," she said as she looked out to sea. "Do you remember it? Or is it like with Dany?" he asked. "I have no memory of it," she said truthfully, and heard his relieved breath. "The world then was as it is now. The true enemy was always here, Egg. Without you and Dany, I wouldn't be strong enough to stop him. I'd not have been able to hatch Balerion, but I'd still have been a threat, and so I'd have been among the first to die. Rosiane said, her words spoken with no emotion, though they were hard for her to say aloud. She felt herself being pulled towards her brother, and then she was leaning against his chest as he held her tightly to him. Rhaenys closed her eyes and allowed the feel of him and the rise and fall of his chest to comfort her. "We'll do it right this time, Ray. You, me, and Dany. We'll do it right, and I swear to you that no one will harm any of my family. No one," Aegon said determinedly, and she nodded as he held her tightly. When they reached where the ships were to dock, she was then finally able to fly on a dragon once more. Aegon telling both Balerion and Lyra Rookes they weren't allowed to come with them before he then spoke to Diane and said they'd be back soon. It was almost time for her to fly on Balderion's back, for true. Both she and the dragon could feel it, but Aegon had asked her, and so she'd agreed not to fly before court had been taken. Her brother wished for her to be much more experienced before going into battle, and though she feared for him and Dany going without her, she deferred to him on this for now, who felt at first as they flew over the city she wasn't sure, but it was clear by how he stiffened that Aegon felt it too. There was evil in that place. Death, and it had taken the entire city for its own. As they flew back, she saw the group that Aegon had sent on ahead, and so they landed near them to learn what it was that they themselves had found out. Aegon helped her down from Rakal's back, and she joined him as they spoke to Dany and the Greyjoys. Her brother gone once more, and the king now back again. "You saw much of the city?" Aegon asked. "We didn't go inside, Your Grace, but we saw as much as we could," Younger Greyjoy said, and Rhaenys felt the woman looked almost terrified as she spoke. "Did you see any hostages? Any that were not?" Aegon said, struggling to find the words. "There were none unless they're deeper inside and close to the center, Your Grace. All those that we could see were the same. They were all those things. What was it you called them?" Dario said, looking to Yara. "Waits," Yara said, her expression still the same as it had been when she'd spoken a moment earlier. "They're not whites," Theon said as Aegon bid him continue. "They're different. They're whites, but not whites. I can't explain it other than they seem different." "Your ship is safe?" Aegon asked to a nod from Theon. "Make your way back to the camp and to the ships at sea. I want you on the water where you're at. Your best." With a look to her, Aegon turned and they both walked to Rogiag, and less than a moment later they were flying back towards their camp. Once they arrived, Aegon immediately called a meeting, and then after giving his orders to their men, he pulled her to one side to speak to her. "I want you on the ship with Rhea, Arya, and Robb. Balerion and Lyriax will stay by your side, as will Cerebrian. I'll have the Greyjoys provide escort, and should it come to it, and the need arises for you to leave, you leave." Aegon said, "Egg, my family, Ray, you, Rhea, Arya, and Robb. You're all I have left, and I need to know you're safe before I can even think about what I'm about to do. It won't be long until you and Balerion are flying with us, but not today." Olyang said, leaving no room for argument. "Not today," she said, and then he leaned forward to kiss her cheek. "We found each other, Rosia. In this life we found each other. I've thanked the gods for that every day since Bravos. We found each other, and we will have the life that we should have had. You, me, Dany, and Rose. We're the last dragons in this world, the only dragons in this world for now. In time, there will be more. My daughter will have brothers and sisters, and you, Rosier, you will have children of your own. Our house will grow. Our family will grow. Do you believe me?" Aegon asked, and she nodded vigorously. "I love you, big sister," he said before he then kissed her cheek once more. She stood on the deck as the ship sailed away and out into the open water. Beside her, Missandei held Rhaella in her arms, and above their heads, Balerion and Lodorax flew. On the seashore, she could see both Aegon and Dany looking her way, and both of them waiting like she was until they could see each other no more before they moved. Rhaenys then closed her eyes and offered up a prayer to the gods that had seen fit to reunite them, to do so once again, to keep her family safe in the war to come. Battle of Court 3006 AC. Dany, she flew towards the docks, while Aegon and Rhaegal flew to the main gate. Dany tried her very best not to think about the last time she'd been here in this city and all that had happened to her while she'd stayed here, only to find her thoughts would go nowhere else. Memories of Zera Lujan Daxos and Doria led to her wondering if their bodies were still behind that vault door. She found herself thinking of quite Rhaenys as she now knew her to be, and she wondered if things would have been different if her niece had come forward then and told her the truth. Would it have been as Rhaenys had said and led to the doom of all, or would it have made her path to the life she now knew just a little easier? Had she known that she was not alone, would it have brought her as much comfort as finding the truth out about Aegon had, or would it have left her fearful that Rhaenys would seek to take her place, since she had the greater claim to the throne? In the end, it was maybe for the best that it was now and not then that she'd found out the truth. The same as it was about Aegon's own truth, she thought as she saw the docks come into sight. "Dracarys," she said as she flew over the first of the ships. Her thoughts could only be on what she needed to do now, as Drogon's flames swept over the first set of ships. With them aflame, it was to the docks themselves they flew, and she saw the arrows fly towards her in the air. It gave her a moment of hesitation when she looked at those firing them, and she saw that they looked like living men and not the dead they'd faced before. Were it not for their eyes then, she'd have thought twice about letting Drogon's flames welcome them into their warm embrace. Their eyes, though, were eyes she'd seen before, and those eyes didn't belong on living things. "Dracarys," she said as Drogon let loose again and again. 5 passes, 6, maybe 7, before she was done, and she looked off in the distance to where the main gate would be. She could see the fire rising, and yet it wasn't spreading, and so rather than fly over their own ships and give them the signal to dock, she flew towards Rhaegal and Aegon to find out why they'd not moved further into the city. As she flew over the city itself, she saw Azero's palace, and her memories were back once more. Memories of finding her unsullied dead and looking down on Yrsa's body in the fear and sense of loss she had felt when she'd realized her dragons had been stolen. Her anger at the warlocks and at Doria and Zachara and Daxus for what they'd done and what they'd cost her. As they flew over House of the Undying, she felt Drogon's anger that it still stood. Her son almost pleading with her for the command to let loose his flames. But for now, Dany refused. She saw the Khalasar ride, and yet they didn't enter the city. Instead, they cut down men who ran towards them, while Aegon and Rhaegal bathed those who moved out from the city with fire. Directing Drogon to fly closer to his brother, she looked to Aegon, who pointed to the right and nodded at her, Dany following his direction, and soon Rhaegal's fire was joined by Drogon's own. It was only when the men stopped coming that she heard Rhaegal roar, and she looked to see the Draki form up once more and Aegon bringing Rhaegal to the ground to land. "Tigon Drogon, Tigon Hembar Nayut Awahalikia." "Land Drogon, land next to your brother," she said, and Drogon did as he was bid, while Dany looked to the burned gate to see it empty. Rhaegal. Burn the gates and enter the city. It was easy, a simple plan, and he was willing to carry it out, or had been until he flew over the city himself. On Rhaegal's back, with Rhaegal behind him, he'd felt it, and almost immediately he knew that he couldn't follow it through. There was a darkness in the city, a presence, and the only way he knew to describe it was to name it as evil and leave it at that. It wasn't the same as the dead he'd faced at Hardhome or Winterfell, not even close. Other than perhaps with Bran, he doubted that he'd felt such a thing before. This was corruption, deep and dark, and it wanted him to come to it, to move to it. It called to him and bid him enter, and it bothered him that a part of him wished to. It worried him that it perhaps called only to him, and yet it scared him with the thoughts that it called to the others too. So he changed his plans, fire, and wait for them to come to him. Outside and not inside, he'd see this battle fought, and so after telling Dany to the docks, he headed for the gates and readied the Khalasar and the Unsullied for the battle to come. "Tano, ride but don't enter. Ride and cut them down and then regroup, just like you did in Winterfell," he said, looking to the large man. "The walls, Calvar?" Colano asked. "Will be bathed in fire, and so will any who move in front of them. Rhaegal and I will be your escort, Hano." Jurgen said to a smile from the Dothraki leader, "Lord Jon, you lead the infantry. Hold them back, and don't march unless the Khalasar needs you." "Of course, your grace," Jon Connington said. "Ser Jaime, Ser Giara, I'd have you both on horses overlooking the city. Giara the Khalasar, Jaime the infantry, and the other mounted men. Should they be diverting from the plans, then I'd ask you both to bring them back into line. I don't wish us to enter this city other than by my command. Is that clear?" he asked. "Aye, it's clear, your grace," Yora said. "Your grace," Jaime said with a small nod. "What are my orders?" Tormund asked, a half-smile on his face. To fuck people up in your own unique way, Tormund, he said to laughs. But not to enter the city, Tormund asked, and Aegon shook his head. I'll burn this city to the ground if need be. There is death here, and though we want to take it as undamaged as possible and see if there are people there still alive, I'll not do so at the risk of any of your lives. We take the gate, wait for them to come, and don't enter. Understood? He asked, and received no argument. It was a simple plan, and though he'd told Daisy not to divert from her own, he was glad to see her when she and Drogon arrived. After a number of passes, those inside had stopped coming towards them, and the gates had long since burned away. Aegon told Rhaegal to land, and Drogon followed a few moments later. He moved to the Black Dragon quickly to make sure that he and Daisy were unharmed. "You're unhurt?" he asked, as he helped his wife down from Drogon's back. "I'm well, as is Drogon. We set the ships alight, and the docks are ours, should we wish it, but I've not given the ships the signal to land." "Daintiad," and Aegon smiled at her before reaching out to take her hand in his. "Rosier took down countless of them, but there are still more inside, and I'm torn between using the dragons or leading the men into the city," he said softly as they walked. "You can't lead them?" Dany said worriedly. "I must. It has to be me. I'd have Jaime with me and Tormund, but I can't send them to do what I would not," Aegon said. "You're a kingy, Aegon. That's what you're supposed to do," Dane said, frustrated. "We'll speak to Melora if she agrees." "Yeah, Aegon, is that how it's to be? Each time I wish you to not do something, you'll just bring the three-eyed raven in so you can get your way." Dany said, her anger clear, as he moved away from him. Dee, he said, reaching out for her hand. "It's that or burn the city to the ground, and I don't wish to do that unless it's a last resort," he said, as she looked at him. "Drogon and I will fly overhead, Yogon, if I feel the need for you to leave, then you leave. Promise me that and live up to that promise, and I'll agree." "I promise. Should you feel the need for us to leave, we leave. No questions or further talk on it," he said, and she looked at him carefully before nodding. Tormund, his friend was a fool. Gods, he loved the boy, but at times he could be a complete fool, and this was one of them. He loved to fight as much as the next man, and his sword was barely wet with the blood of these things, so he'd have loved nothing more than a tougher and longer fight. That didn't mean he wished to walk through these streets and feel those blue eyes look at him as he did so. True, he couldn't see them anywhere, but he and those with him could feel them, and he'd have much preferred if they'd just used the dragons and burned this city to the ground. The sister fucker, but not the beauty or the bear. The lord that was kissed by fire, and Jon Snow led more than 2,000 men through this city, and from the time they had entered it, there had been no sign of any of those fucking dead things. For dead things, they were no matter what the woman in red or the three-eyed raven said. He'd seen their eyes, and the only things with eyes that color were the fucking dead. "Where the fuck are they?" he asked, annoyedly, as they cleared yet another street. "So eager to meet them, are you, Tormund?" Jon Snow asked, and Tormund chuckled. "I fucking knew I should have been more like the sour-faced crow," he said to a laugh from Jon. "You'd have never wished to be left in charge of a keep. You'd get too fucking bored," Jon said, and Tormund shook his head. "I'd have been safe. I'm never fucking safe with you," he said to an even louder laugh. "Like I said, bored." The little fucker was right. He could have stayed with his people, beyond the wall, and had a nice comfortable life. There were no more crows to attack them, and force them from their lands, and further north. No more dead men marching on them to force them south, and onto the crows as there had once been. Life, though, would have been fucking boring, and he'd have died an old and bored graybeard. That was not the end for him, and besides, without him here, the little fuck would have no one to take the piss out of him, for by the gods he needed it. Jon Snow was surrounded by kneelers and arse-kissers, and while there were few who deserved their arses kissed as much as he or the Dragon Queen did, a man needs to have his balls broken every now and then. "What the fuck are you smiling about now?" the Lord Kissed by Fire asked him. "Remembering the time I was thought a king," Tormund said as he looked to see the bright smile on Jon Snow's face. "Who thought you a king?" the sister fucker asked. "That kneeler over there," he said, pointing to Jon Snow, who was chuckling as he shook his head. "Come on, your grace, we've work to do." Jon said, and Tormund laughed as they entered another street, the laugh soon ending and the smile quickly leaving his face as he looked to the sky and breathed in relief when he saw the Dragon Queen and her mighty beast. "Well, I guess we found them then," he said, as in the wide-open square in front of them, There seemed to be thousands upon thousands of blue eyes all staring right at them. Jon Connington. The wilding irritated and annoyed him with how little respect he showed to the king. That the king seemed to accept it from him confused him greatly. But the two had an odd relationship to say the least, and it was only the wilding that the king accepted it from. Perhaps he should be happier about it. A king willing to allow a little disrespect was a good thing, and Aerys never being able to forgive or forget a slight may well have been a sign that he and others should have taken more notice of. Watching Aegon and Daenerys, as their dragons laid down fire, was a sight that he was thankful to the gods for. Finding a good king and queen to serve had been something he'd given up hope of the moment that Rhaegar fell. In his son and sister, though, he'd found it, and the more time he spent around either of them, the clearer it was that they were who he hoped them to be. He'd seen it in Braavos and Meereen, how they cared for the people here, but also remembered those they ruled in Westeros, too. The food shipments had already been sent to the north and to King's Landing. Winter had come, and the people of Westeros needed to be fed, and so fed they would be. If he could change either of them, then it would be in only one regard and only in one of them for true. Aegon was too reckless, not with his plans or his campaigns, but with his own life. When it came to those who fought for Daenerys and him, then he was as protective as a father was with his children. With himself, he was very much not. And Jon, while reveling in hearing the things that he had already done, worried about them and those to come greatly. This was a folly, a mistake, and though he'd spoken out against it, he'd been overruled, and so had insisted he come too. Looking at what was in front of them, he hated being proved right, and yet was glad that he was here by Aegon's side. Form up, Jaime Lannister said, and Jon looked to the sky to see the queen bringing the dragon in to let loose its flames, and he breathed a huge sigh of relief. Then time seemed to slow. Jon looked on as Aegon moved away from them, and he heard him speak words that made no sense. Why did he need to shield his eyes and turn away? What was his king doing? No, come back, you fool. Questions and a cry out, and then he saw the sword being unsheathed, the light shining from it, and he heard the dragon's roar. It shined so very brightly that he was forced to turn his head, not even the arm he'd placed in front of his eyes stopping the light from getting through. As he looked to the others, he saw they too were shielding their own eyes and had their heads turned away from Aegon and his shining sword. After a few moments, the light was no more, and he heard the dragon's angry roar as it landed next to Aegon. Jon turned to make sure his king was unharmed, and he couldn't believe his eyes. What had been thousands of people with blue eyes was no more. The people remained, but their eyes had changed, and each of them now wore confused looks, where a moment earlier their expressions were full of anger and hate. He looked to see Aegon help Daenerys off Drogon's back, and Jaime Lannister and Tormund Giantsbane moved to the king and queen, and so he did likewise, only catching the end of the words that Aegon was speaking. Light forces the darkness away, he heard Aegon say, and as he looked at all those he'd feared would overwhelm them, he could see no darkness in them anymore. Prota 306 AC. Dany, she and Drogon had flown over the city, and had felt what Aegon had said to her. The darkness and corruption was almost a living, breathing thing. As below her Aegon and those with him moved through empty streets, Dany had looked to the streets ahead of her husband and been relieved that they too had been empty. Seeing the large crowd that was gathered in the center of the city had taken her aback, and knowing that Aegon was heading straight for them, put her on edge. Both she and Drogon quickly making themselves ready to do whatever it took to make sure that her husband came back to her unharmed. When she saw him move towards the crowd alone, for some reason she felt no fear, almost as if she knew what it was he was going to do. So she told Drogon to look away, and shielded her own eyes, and then the light from the sword began to shine just as brightly as it had when he'd faced off against the Night King. When it dimmed, she could feel it immediately. The darkness and corruption that she'd felt earlier were not more and as she looked to the people, of course, she knew they were no threat to Aegon or to herself. Still, when she bid Drogon land, she had him roar just so those nearest to Aegon and herself knew what they'd face if she had read them wrongly. Aegon helped her down from Drogon's back, Dany's eyes roaming over every inch of her husband to be certain he was as unharmed as she believed him to be. Seeing him smile at her when he noticed what she was doing quickly brought a smile to her own face, and before she knew it, he was holding her in his arms and kissing her deeply. "Aegon?" she asked, when he finally gave her a chance to breathe, her smile fuller now as she saw his own. "Card is yours, my queen," Aegon said, as he kissed her once more. Behind him, Yaima Lannister, Jon Connington, and Tormund moved towards them, and their men lowered their weapons when they realized they'd face no more fighting today. Aegon took her hand, and Dany found herself looking to the crowds who'd begun to look less confused than they had been, her husband then moving her to Drogon and telling her to climb back onto her dragon's back. When she went to argue with him, he kissed her again and said he'd be joining her in a moment, Dany looking at him to make sure he wasn't just telling her what she wished to hear. "I promise, Dany. We need to let the others know that the city is ours and they need to see you and me on our dragons," Aegon said, and so she nodded her agreement and watched as he spoke to Jon, Jaime, and the others. Once he had done so and joined her on Drogon's back, they flew to the outside of the city and found Relgiel waiting for them. Drogon landing beside his brother before Elgian climbed down to speak to his own dragon and to their men. Then, just as he had said he would, he climbed up onto Relgiel, and within moments they were in the air once more. This time they flew almost slowly over the city, the two dragons flying low so they could both be seen, and more important, so she and her husband could be seen on their backs. She saw Jon Connington speak to some men that she knew were the most important in the city, and her eyes sought out the warlocks and the men who'd taken up the role of the 13, or to see if any of the pure blood were there, and she was sure she saw men who may be from both. Expecting Aegon to land in the city once again, she was surprised when instead he flew out to sea, and she smiled as she followed him. They flew over their ships, over Asha Greyjoy's flagship, and finally over their own ship, and she was happy to see Rhaenys and Missandei on deck, and that Rhaenyra was with them. Liarax and Balerion then joined the other dragons in the sky, and Dany was certain she heard Aegon speak to both dragons, though she couldn't make out the words. All too soon they headed back to the city, and she took comfort in the thought that she'd soon be holding Rosier in her arms once more. This time they did land, and Aegon climbed down from Rosier more quickly than she did from Drogon. Her husband was standing in front of the green dragon by the time she reached the ground. So after speaking to Drogon and telling him how proud she was of him, something she knew that Aegon was doing with Rosier too, she then told her son to go and feed and that she'd call for him later. Just as before, Aegon came to her and took her hand and led her to Jaime, Jon, Tormund, and the others. "Your graces," Jon said as Jaime moved behind her husband's back, and Jorah, who she'd not noticed was standing with them, did likewise to her own. "All is well, Jon," Aegon asked, his voice almost light and cheerful. "The city elders wish to greet you both, your grace, so they can kneel and pledge their fealty." Jon said proudly, "Then best we let them do so." Yexud and Dainty found she was on the verge of laughing loudly, with just how casually he said it. Jon led them to a nearby palace, and when they arrived at it, she was surprised to see them waiting outside in the gardens rather than inside. The great and the good, of course, the 13, the Tourmaline Brotherhood, the ancient guild of spicers, and even the pureblood, all taking to a knee when they saw her and Aegon walk into the garden. Her eyes sought out, but could not find any of the warlocks, which relieved her greatly, and then she heard a voice call out loudly, "Course, the greatest city that ever was or ever will be is yours, your graces." One of the purebloods said, and Aegon looked to her to accept their oath. "Rise all of you, we accept your fealty and welcome you into our empire," she said, leaving them in no doubt that when they moved on from her, it would not be leaving a free course behind them. "We thank you, your graces, and we pledge to be your leal subjects from this day forth," the member of the pureblood who had spoken said, and Dany was surprised by just how genuine he sounded. The palace they were given as their own was one of the largest, if not the largest of all, in Korth. Its opulence made Jero Jane Daxos seem almost a hut in comparison. Jero saw that their men were brought into the city, and almost all of them were able to set up in the palace's grounds. Those who were not were given their pick of the manses nearby. It took what felt like an age for Rosier and the others to make their way to them. Aegon leaving to escort them personally as Dany spoke to Jon Connington and asked his take on the Corathines. "They are yours, your grace, I've no doubt of that. What exactly that means, I know not, as I don't see fighting men amongst them." Jon said, shaking his head. "This city was never truly built on that. Its walls and its wealth enough to keep it protected," she said, before adding, "Until now. Indeed, I spoke to those who led this city, your grace, none of whom can really remember anything other than the wish to kill and to attack, had his grace not showed them Lightbringer." Jon said, leaving the rest unsaid, for now, and before she could ask him more, she saw Ghost and heard the sound of Liarax and Balerion as they landed in the gardens. "Your grace, Missandei had called out a moment later, her smile a relieved one to see her unhurt, and yet it was the bundle in her arms that Dany had found herself concentrating on. "My sweet babe," she said softly as she thanked Missandei and took Rhaenyra from her. Her daughter was wide awake and looked to be taking in her new surroundings. As she spoke softly to her daughter, Aegon and Rhaenys walked into the room, followed by Jaime, Jorah, Brienne, and Grey Worm. Dany feeling even more relieved to see that they were all here and that the taking of this city had cost them very little, if anything. Storm's End 306, Edric Storm. He had taken the insults to his name and his reputation, because he had to, and though he'd accepted them publicly, privately, he had fumed. There was nothing he could do, though, as he had no way to fight against a united realm, let alone dragons. So he had smiled politely, knelt and sworn his fealty, and then he'd prayed to the Seven for a sign. It had come not long after he'd marched back to Storm's End. And news that the Targaryens were heading first to Dorne and then to Winterfell, showing that their reign wasn't as secure as they may have believed. Edric had sat and watched. He'd waited, and though he'd been annoyed that they'd managed to take care of their enemies so easy, it did at least prove his wisdom in standing down. Just as the visit from the Faceless Man had proved him right to hesitate in regards to Gendry Waters, or Stark as he was now, if one thing good had come from the Targaryens dealing with the threat in the north, it was that his half-brother, should he seek a seat, would look there rather than to Storm's End. Something that made his position even more secure and would at least give him a starting point should the opportunity arise for him to become what he was born to be. An opportunity that in some ways presented itself when news came that the vast majority of the Targaryen army, the dragons, and the king and queen themselves would be heading east and be gone for some time. He'd barely believed it when Serdrew had brought the news. The mere thoughts that they sought to conquer and bring Essos to heel were ones that opened up so many possibilities. When they'd set out, he'd called his closest advisors to his solar and laid out his plans. Some of them arguing with him, and yet all agreeing in the end. He needed coin, and so that meant withholding it from the crown and making excuses for why he did so. "Is this wise, my lord?" Sir Andrew asked. "If we play it right, it is," he said as he wrote the numbers down on the parchment. "Should they return?" Sir Tristan asked worriedly. "They won't for the withholding of taxes, only for the non-payment of them, and it will take time for the crown to be certain that it's the latter we're doing," he said, smiling at his own cleverness. "And when they are certain," Sir Geralt asked, "by then we'll be ready to strike, and the dragons will find Essos to be as vast as we did," he said to nods. The ravens arrived first, requests to pay their due, demands to do so, and to see an accounting of their books. Edric writing out the replies himself and explaining how much the Stormlands had suffered under his uncle's rule and Lannister mismanagement. He pleaded that they needed time to come up with the coin and that they were suffering and needed to spend coin on their people as well. Winter, though not as harsh as it could have been for some reason, was still winter after all, he had said. There were keeps that needed work done to them, stores that needed refilling, and once he'd seen to that, then he'd be glad to give the crown their due. When the ravens grew angrier, he'd then tried another tactic, begging for deferments and promising to pay double in the years to come. That it was something he had no intent to do was not anything they needed to know. Yet at least he knew that soon the spider's little birds would look his way and that perhaps the crown would lose their patience with him and seek to force him to do so. Lady Anya's words showing their growing discontent with his excuses and attitude. Edric also knew that, without the dragons, he was untouchable behind the walls of Storm's End, and should they send men to take him out, he'd break them against those walls. If anything, he hoped they'd gather an army and march to him, as it would be easier for him to defeat them here rather than on an open field. While his advisors preached caution, he wished to be bold, and he found he disagreed with their counsel at times. The Vale and Riverlands, like him, had knelt only because it was a dragon that forced them to. Without that threat, they'd rise, he believed. Old alliances still held strong, and it was his father that had forged them with Hoster Tully and Jon Arryn, and he was nothing if not his father's son. "How goes the work?" he said to Sir Andrew as he walked the parapets and looked down on Shipbreaker Bay. "The weapons and armor are easy enough, my lord. Men are proving more difficult," Sir Andrew said as Edric shook his head. "Our numbers?" he asked curiously. "All told, maybe 25,000, possibly less." "Not enough," he said, and Andrew looked at him without answering. "We need allies, my lord," Andrew said, and Edric sighed before bidding him goodbye and walking back to his rooms. At dinner that night, he ate silently while around him men did likewise. Their worries about the path he'd set them on were clear for all to see. And while his silence was not out of worry, it was the path he was contemplating. It was all meant to be so easy: arrive back and take back his family seat and his rightful home, and then reach out to the Dragon Queen with an offer she'd not be able to refuse. Or at least that had been the plan. He'd not counted on another bastard beating him to the punch and taking what was rightfully his, nor on a story better than the one he'd wished to be sung. It was supposed to be the son of a beloved king coming back and putting aside the animosities of the past by uniting his claim with the beautiful Dragon Queen. He had believed it would be sung in all the inns and taverns of Westeros, and that when they wed, they'd be cheered loudly by one and all. Instead, it was the song of ice and fire and of a dragon hiding as a wolf. A story that painted the rebellion in a different light and named the heroes of it as villains, and his father not as a man seeking to fight for the honor of the woman he loved, but a jealous man who lied because he'd not been able to accept the truth. Lords who should be his had knelt for Jon Snow, and a crown he was born to wear now sat another head. A woman who should be in his bed had lain with another and birthed him a princess of the realm rather than the son she should have birthed Edric. They'd not even saw fit to give him a seat on the council as recompense for all they'd stolen from him, and so he'd see them fall, though he hoped they'd do so in Essos long before they ever looked his way again. Finishing his meal, he then drank far too much and fell into his bed. His thoughts filled with silver hair and violet eyes, and yet his dreams were not. Instead, when he woke the next morning, it was with another thought in his mind, one that refused to leave him all day. So after he'd locked himself in his solar for an hour with no distractions and had just sat looking down on a map of the 7 kingdoms, he called for Ser Andrew and Ser Gerold and sent for refreshments, the 2 men arriving within moments of each other. "Sit, both of you. There is much we must discuss," he said as he offered them wine and food that both partook of. "My lord?" Ser Andrew asked, looking at him curiously when he'd not spoken for some time. "As you know, I had hoped to be wed by now, Ser Andrew. I had thought that it would be me and Daenerys who sat the throne, and that by uniting our claims and our houses, Westeros would finally lay the rebellion and the War of the 5 Kings to rest," he said far more composedly than he had expected. "Indeed, my lord," Ser Andrew said, his confusion still present in both his voice and expression. "Much though I feel that in time the people would accept me, especially with Snow and the Queen deserting them as they look east, I alone may not be enough, and so I once again find myself seeking a bride," he said, smiling. "A good thing, my lord, but who brings advantage?" Ser Gerold said, and Edric's smile grew fuller. "Would that was one that brought me men or a kingdom, or that I'd have known of the marriage between the Queen and Snow earlier. Had I then, the match I seek may have brought me a rather large advantage. As it is, while at first she may not bring me so in men and support, she does in her name and with the story we can sell to the realm," he said, almost laughing now at the looks both men wore, neither of them following his train of thought, and were he not so certain he was right, it may have given him pause. "My lord?" Ser Andrew asked. "I need you to undertake a journey, Ser Andrew. You and some men have a long way to go to bring my bride back to me," he said, and then added, before Ser Andrew could ask more questions, "Sansa Stark, Serat, I need you to travel north and to bring Sansa Stark to me." What better union to sell to the realm than the one of the House of the Wolf and the House of the Stag, the one his father had sought all those years earlier? Together both of them could speak of how their fathers would never have wished them to see the realm lay down with dragons, and though she didn't bring the support she should have, the old alliances and blood would soon see that support come, especially once he showed them how weak the dragons had left the realm since their departure. Court 326 AC. Melora, she had not seen it for herself. Well, not through her own eyes, at least. Melora, instead, watching through the eyes of an eagle, as the prince had brought the old gods' light to the people of Kars. Were she to ask Kinvara, it would be R'hllor's light that the Red Priestess named it as. For her, it was the old gods who had gifted the prince so, and to them that she offered her thanks. Just looking at the people who passed by the palace they stayed in was enough to show that she wasn't the only one offering thanks for what had been done. Melora had seen what they had become, and though not whites exactly, they were as close as one could be. Ones that breathed and whose hearts still beat, that was had they been dead and raised as the whites the prince had faced at Winterfell and in the north. And not even Lightbringer would have been enough to help them. Powerful though the sword and the prince himself were, he didn't have the power over life and death. The Ironborn were wrong as what is dead may and needed to die, especially if their eyes were an unearthly blue. After it had been done and the queen had said her words to the prince, her worries about the risks he took and the danger he put himself in soon fading away, Melora had joined with them as they settled into the palace. She'd been given a set of rooms, and though she'd wished to look for the path ahead, instead she'd welcomed and looked forward to the celebration that was to come. So after taking in the sight of people coming by the palace hoping for a glimpse of the prince and the queen, she then made her way to her room and dressed for the night ahead. "My lady," Sirjar said as she passed him and entered into a large open hall. Melora looked at the sheer expanse of it and knew from her own experience the expense it must have cost to build and furnish such a thing. It put the great hall of the High Tower to shame and reminded her more of the one at Highgarden than anywhere else. Though its marble floors and carved stone were something that not even the Tyrells or Lannisters would have been able to afford. The plates, cups, mugs, and glasses too were of a quality she'd never seen before, and it made her wonder just how wealthy this city had truly been and what her prince and queen would do with that wealth. "A fine sight, is it not?" Tormund Giantsbane said, catching her by surprise and taking her from the almost trance she'd fallen into as she'd looked around the room. "Makes Ruddy Hall seem like nothing," he added before laughing loudly, and Melora shook her head, having no idea what or where Ruddy Hall was. "Lady Melora, join us," the queen said, and Melora smiled at her and at the prince, who was holding the princess in his arms while talking to his sisters. His sister's own babe was laying in a crib that had been brought into the room with Ghost, laying down beside him. "I thank you, my queen, my king," she said, taking her seat. Her prince he may be, but he was truly a king too, and soon to be an emperor, she wagered. Kinvara joined her not long after, and she was surprised to see the Dragon Guard join them, all 3 members of it not on duty, and instead it was men of the Unsullied who stood guard this night. They and the dragons who she could see through the open windows. Lord Jon spoke to Grey Worm while the Dragon Guard spoke amongst themselves. Jaime Lannister occasionally speaking to Lord Jon at times also. The prince picked at his food and spent most of the night laughing at his daughter, and rarely had she seen someone so at peace. Even when he allowed Lord Rainsins to take the princess into her arms, and when Arya moved to her own babe, he sat with the same contented look on his face. His expression only changing when the queen leaned in to whisper something in his ear and to place a kiss on his lips, or when Tormund made a jape at his expense. She was happy to see it and felt it most needed. This brief moment of calm before plans would need to be made for where they went from here. "They look happy," Kinvara said, and Melora turned to her. The meal in front of the Red Priestess finished for once. "They do. It brings me joy to see it," she said, and the smile on Kinvara's face was enough to show she felt the same. "As it does me, together they are everything I had wished them to be. Aegon may be the prince that was promised, and Azir Ahai reborn, but Daenerys is no, Nissa, and only with her by his side can his heart beat true." Kinvara said, her smile not diminishing as she spoke. "The princess, too. Never have I seen 2 people who were more in need of a child than they," she said as she watched Rhaenys hand the princess over to the queen. "I feel there is something more for the prince here, Lady Melora. My God tells me this, though. He shows me it not. Perhaps your own will be more forthcoming," Kinvara said, her voice almost a whisper, as around them people laughed and japed as the prince and Tormund told tales of the true north. "I shall seek answers before I take to my bed," she said, and Kinvara seemed relieved by her words. She strolled through the palace after she'd bid them all good night. Melora not hurrying or delaying her walk to her room, and instead just simply enjoying the pace of it. When she reached it, she nodded to her 2 guards and bid them good night as they took up their positions, and then she walked inside. After she'd undressed, she sat cross-legged on the bed and closed her eyes, quickly clearing her mind of all thoughts before she began to look into the past, present, and future to see what it was her gods wished for her to do, and to find whatever it was the prince needed in this city. It surprised her when she did, and though she then slept that night, it wasn't a restful sleep that she found herself enjoying. The thoughts of that place and what the queen had seen there not allowing her to rest easy. Why they wished him to go there, she knew not. Only that there was something he needed in the former house of the Undying, that he had to go there and the queen would not be happy with her for sending him. So she waited until she got the chance to speak to him alone, Melora first seeking out Kinvara to ask her own opinion on the place, and relieved to hear her tell her that she felt the prince to be in no danger. Whatever it was the gods wished for him to do there, it wouldn't cause him harm or pain, and Melora was comforted by that. When she did get the chance to speak to him, he was standing by the dragons and Jaime Lannister stood a few feet away. The prince speaking to Rhaegal and Balerion, while Leorix and Drogon looked on. "You caught me," he said with a chuckle, without turning around, his hand rubbing over Rosiak's neck, as the dragon trilled. "I was thanking him and his brother for all they did, and telling these two that their own time would come. They seem happy, the blue one especially," she said, looking to Balerion. "He knows it's almost time." Aegon said, finally turning to her, the smile he wore, a true one she felt as she'd come to notice that he had more than one. "Time, my prince," she asked before it struck her. What he meant, Aegon's words confirming it a moment later. "To fly with my sister," Aegon said as he moved towards her. "I take it you have some news for me," he asked. The smile was gone, and his voice far more serious now. "There's somewhere you must visit, my prince. A place where answers await," she said softly. "Alone?" he asked, and she nodded. "And my wife will not approve, will she?" "Her grace may be fearful, my prince," she said as he looked at her and nodded. "When?" he asked, surprising her as she'd not told him where yet. "Before we leave, my prince, it's not something you must do imminently," she said as she stared at him and saw an almost resigned look come over his face. "I'll need to speak to my wife. No doubt we'll argue on this. Where am I to go?" he asked, and she felt sorry that she was to be the cause of any issue between the prince and the queen, but knew she had her role to play. "The House of the Undying, my prince," she said. And the sigh he made was a loud one. Carded 3006 AC. "Rosiers?" Aegon had almost demanded that the armor was made by Gendry. True enough, he'd asked the man to do so, but he'd left no one in any doubt that it was only his good brother Zrork that he'd accept for her protection. It brought a smile to her face to see him so protective, and she was even more surprised when he designed it himself. That it was so like the set that Dany wore was another thing that made her happy to wear it. Though it was the knowledge of what was to occur once she did that more than anything made her eager for it to be ready. The time had come for her to finally fly on Balerion's back. The dragon was now large enough for her to ride despite its age, and she at first had been confused by that. Lady Kinvara then explaining to her that the magic of the other dragons, of her brother and of all three of them being together, was the reason for the dragon's growth. Leorix dwarfed Balerion, and both of the younger dragons were much smaller than Rhaegal and Drogon, and yet she believed that by year's end they'd be almost of a size with their older brothers. As she was helped to put it on, the words her brother had said about her needing someone to do this each time finally made sense, and then she felt her heart begin to race. Both Dany and Aegon had taken her up on Drogon and Rhaegar, and it was like nothing she had ever even dared to dream. To be able to fly on the back of a dragon and to see the world from up high, few even in her family had ever done so. Fewer still since the Danes of the Dragon, and now there would be a third dragon rider in the world. She had another reason why she felt so excited by it, a more personal one too. It was the culmination of all she'd gone through and of all that she had lost. The time had arrived for her to finally become what she was always meant to be, a dragon rider, a sister, a good sister, an aunt, and the third head of the dragon. "How do I look?" she asked as she spun in front of Gendry. "Like a dragon," he said, making her laugh. The armor felt light and covered everywhere that it needed to. It wasn't a full suit and was more flexible because of it. Something that she much appreciated as she began to move around in it to get used to how it felt. When she stepped out of her room, it was to find Aegon waiting for her, the look on his face one that made her nervous for a moment, though the smile that appeared once he saw her worried look was one that she most welcomed. "A dragon," he said happily. And she felt her pride begin to rise, something about the words and the way he said it feeling different to how Gendry had just said almost the same thing. Though she was older than Iacon, she felt younger. Almost as if he had spent more time in the world than she, and it was only after he'd told her that he had lived another life that she realized why that was. She was 20 and 7, and Iacon 20 and 4, and yet he had lived for 7 decades on top of that. That she almost felt a girl each time she was around him, only making him feel older still, and she found, if anything, that she appreciated it. He could be at times fatherly, brotherly, and at times a fool. Something that he was doing now as they began to walk to where the dragons were waiting for them. "Stop it," she said, as he made faces to try and make her laugh. "Rosier," he said, blowing out his cheeks so they were larger and full of air. "Egg," she said, shaking her head, and pretending not to be as amused as she truly was, and then losing her fight with seriousness when he bumped her shoulder and then fell to the ground over dramatically. "You are an idiot, brother mine," she said, laughing fully as he begged Saryami to come to his aid. It was only when they reached the dragons and he helped her up onto Balerian's back that she understood why he'd been acting so foolish. The nervousness that she may have felt about being alone on a dragon's back, never materializing, and instead it was to the sound of her own laughter that she bid Balerian fly. "Sovagun Balerian, fly Balerian," she said, and in moments the dragon was in the air. Her eyes were looking straight ahead as Balerian and Rhaegal flew over the city, not too fast or too high, and when she looked to Aegon, she could see his worries and fears clear on his face. She smiled beamingly at him to let him know that she was comfortable, and then she bid Balerian go faster. "Jikagana dere, go fast." Within moments he had left Rhaegal behind, and she risked looking over her shoulder to see where her brother and the Green Dragon were, soon finding them as they quickened their own flight. "Ealagon. Conir. Down there," she said, and Balerian dropped lower and flew between two towers. Rhaegal soon catching them up, though Aegon kept the Green Dragon behind them, chasing but not catching, and she began to enjoy the idea of a game. "Iglikta higher," she said, her laughter soon ringing out across the sky as the Blue Dragon followed her command, and they began to soar higher than Aegon or Dany had ever taken her before. Up here, the world seemed so very tiny, and after telling Beolian to fly more slowly, she looked to see Aegon and Rhaegal were now just a few feet away. Her brother looking at her worriedly before he too began to laugh when he saw the expression on her face. How long they stayed in the air, she couldn't tell, only that it felt as if time had stood still. So much so that when Aegon pointed down below and she told Beolian to follow Rhaegal, it was only then that she noticed that night was beginning to fall. After they landed, she hurried down from Balerian's back and ran to the Blue Dragon's head, her eagerness to tell Balerian just how happy and proud of her she was, overriding all her other thoughts for now. "Kirinvosi, Balerian, Kirinvosi, Kirinvosi." "Thank you, Balerian, thank you," she said over and over as the Blue Dragon looked at her. Rizia sure she saw joy in the dragon's intelligent eyes, and the sounds she made only making that even more clear. "My sister is pleased, it seems," Aegon said his own joy, just as clear to see, and in the blink of an eye, she'd moved from Balerian to him, and was hugging him tightly, tears of happiness falling from her eyes, as he helped her back into the palace and to her room. He removed her armor himself and told her that they'd fly again on the morrow. This time Daency and Rotha would join them, he said, and she found the idea of all four dragons in the sky to be one that she very much looked forward to. In time she knew that her flights would take on a different meaning. Less about pleasure and more about what she needed to do. Until then, she swore she'd take as much pleasure out of them as she could, and thanked the gods for the chance to be able to do what she had been born to do. Guhor Sira 06 AC. Bellico. Traveling with the fat fool was as annoying as he had expected it to be. Despite them doing so on his most luxurious of pleasure barges, the man still complained constantly, as if he'd been made to walk the distance rather than sit back on his fat arse while others worked. Not even the constant supply of food and women could keep Samwell content, and more than once he'd thought about gutting the fat fool only to hold back, for now at least. It had firmed up his plans and would lead to the fat fool suffering horribly, and so he took comfort in that, even as he grew more and more disgusted and angered each time he looked. Samwell's way, the sailing felt like it took an age. The winds were not as cooperative as they could be, and so he was forced to spend more time in the fat fool's company than he wished for. Each night he'd look on as Samwell gorged himself on food and groped servants. More than once he knew the fat fool had fallen asleep before he'd taken his pleasure with one of the many women he'd provided for him. Bellico only imagining that on those nights the girls themselves slept far more happily. He drank to excess and proclaimed loudly that he'd see Jon Snow fall, and each time he did so was more ridiculous than the last to Bellico's ears. While it was true that Jon Snow, Aegon Targaryen, as he was now known, would fall, it wouldn't be because of anything Samwell did, or at least not because of anything he willingly did. He'd actually learned more about him from Gilly than he had from Samwell. The fat fool's feelings towards the man he'd named his closest friend blinded him to offer up anything of interest. Instead of naming him for what he is and speaking the truth, Samwell diminished all that Jon Snow had done while over-exaggerating his own part in things. Many were the nights where Bellico had to tune him out or look to a servant to distract him, just to shut him up. Were it not for me, he'd never been named Lord Commander. They'd have taken his head if I'd not done what I did. He didn't even wish to seek aid for the watch, just because the Boltons had killed his family. Had I not made him send me to the Citadel, he'd never even have had proof of who he claimed to be. They were variations on a theme, and in all the proclamations he had made, Samwell named himself far more important than he was. He may have played his part in seeing Jon Snow named Lord Commander, but that was perhaps not as good a thing as it could have been. Billico had listened to Samwell speak derisively of the story of Jon Snow saving the free folk and then being killed for it, and had seen the truth in the lies the fat fool spoke. Had he not have been Lord Commander then, true, he would not have been able to bring the free folk through the wall, or perhaps he'd have led them through himself as a king. Maybe he would have sought the position he was born for much sooner. Billico seeing him march south with a red priestess and a blue-eyed king, and watching him take back his home easier and with a lot less loss of life, the ties that bound him to the watch would have remained, and yet not. The care he had for the free folk would have remained, and yet not. Billico had looked on as history played out differently, and he cursed that while his powers would show him this, they'd not show him the past or the present. Not yet, at least. Instead, he was allowed to see alternates, different versions of the same events, and Jon Snow playing his part in all of them. While what he saw helped, it also did not, as he couldn't be certain that the man he saw felt as he now did, and so would not be different than how he truly was. He rose from his bed and placed the black stone with the other pieces before calling for his servants to help him dress. Once he was done, he walked to the deck of the ship and was told by his guards that the fat fool was still sleeping. It comforted him to hear it, as he was beginning to hate his mornings as much as he did the nights. Samwell would wake up to break his fast, and Billico had come to hate the sight and the sounds he made while eating. "We passed Dagger Lake?" he asked, noticing the direction the ship was now sailing. "Last night, Treyarch," Vogo, his captain, said, his words bringing a smile to Billico's face. "How long to Arnoi?" he asked curiously. "A day, 2 at most, Treyarch." "Make it 1, he said. And Vogo nodded, hurrying off to see his will was done, the poles soon joining the sails to make them move a little more quickly. His ship couldn't do so on the Rhone itself, relying far more on its sails to propel it along. On the cordon, though, it could, and as he felt the ship begin to move a little more quickly, he turned and walked to take his seat and to suffer through the morning meal. His own appetite was non-existent now, not even a morsel being required to pass his lips, and yet he still made a show of eating, a mummery of the life he once lived and had now moved past. Soon sleep too would be something he needed, and he wondered what other changes would come when he had the last piece of the black stone in his possession. He sighed when Samwell made his way to the room, the fat fool waddling and looking the worst for wear, and the girl who walked with him looking in a rougher shape than even he. Dinner that night was as he had expected, more gorging groping and more proclamations, and it was only that they passed through Arnoi that allowed for him to enjoy the night. Billico standing on deck as they sailed through the ruined city and feeling the darkness and power that was required to leave a city in such a state to be close at hand. In less than a week they arrived at Quhor, and he was met by Sally's Faramir and Daenerys, Malinar, along with Serena Houghton, and their guards. 3 members of the Church of Starry Wisdom, and the looks on their faces when they saw him were ones he much appreciated. He'd always been used to deference and respect. Now, though, he was finding that worship was something that he truly longed for. Soon it would be awe and fear, perhaps, he thought to himself, as he walked down the gangplank with Samwell, the servants, and his guards behind him. "Seize him," he said, not needing to name who it was. He wished to be seized, and the pained scream and girlish cry that Samwell made was music to his ears. They dragged him through the city, beating him when he fell, and Billico found that he took great pleasure in every kick and slap the fat fool received. Hearing him cry out for him to help him, to beg him to come to his aid, all of it was music to his ears, and when they reached the palace that he was to name his own, he turned to look at the nearly broken man. "You should have made your peace with Jon Snow, Samwell. By his side you may have been safe, and may have lived to see another moon. By mine own you'll not, and in 4 days you'll play your part in my rise. I must admit I'm most pleased. It's to be you, and I look forward to your suffering, as no doubt do my serving girls," he said, his voice calm and composed, and, though he was enjoying the moment greatly, to any who looked on, they'd never know. Carts 3006 AC. Aegon. She lay resting beside him, her silver hair laid out on the pillow and a small smile on her face as she dreamt of something that amused her. He wished to touch her face, and yet feared he'd wake her, and so, instead, he watched her for a few more moments, and then moved quietly from the bed. After he dressed it was to the crib he walked, and he looked down to see his daughter sleeping, and wearing an identical expression as her mother was. Aegon wondering if it was possible that both could be dreaming the same thing, and finding the thoughts of that being true were ones that stirred his heart. Ghost lay beside the crib as he did most nights, his most loyal protector now having someone else. He felt the need to protect, and that brought him more comfort than if he had 1,000 guards standing over his babe. They spent less time together than they both would have liked, and yet perhaps more time than they ever had since before he'd gone to the wall. After he'd arrived there, they'd been parted more than once, and it was only now that he realized he'd been a fool to allow it. Reaching down, he stroked his hand through the soft white fur and felt Ghost's relaxed breathing, the smile coming to his face unbidden as he then turned and moved to the door. Aegon not trying to think whether wolves dreamed too. And yet, as he nodded to Jorah and Jaime joined him as they walked away, it was all he could think of. And so he began to chuckle. "Your Grace?" Jaime asked, and Aegon shook his head. They walked through the palace and then outside, the quietness of the early morning, something that both appreciated, and when they finally reached their destination, he saw the jug of water and the mugs already lined up and the two Unsullied who stood and guarded it. Dismissing them, he turned to Jaime, and with a nod, the knight moved to the two tourney swords. Aegon laughing when he threw, rather than handed him one. "At your mark, Sir Jaime," he said as he took his stance, and with a nod from Jaime, they began. It was more than a spar and had become something he much enjoyed. Yoche, too, Aege marveling in being a teacher, and though Jaime had forgotten perhaps more than Aege knew when it came to swordsmanship, he knew the knight enjoyed their lessons too. At first, his instincts had deserted him, Jaime confessing this to him one night, as they sat and spoke on days long past. The loss of his hand had taken away all that made him who he was, or so he had believed. Aegon doing his best to let him know how wrong he was, and still remembering the look on Jaime's face when he told him what he had. "Who you are is in here, Sir Jaime," he said, pointing to his heart. "Not in here," he said, touching his head. "And certainly not there," he said, touching his golden hand. "That's easy for you to say, Your Grace. You have both your own." Jaime said, his tone showing just how much the loss of his hand had meant to him. "You think yourself lesser because of the loss when what you should understand is that it's made you more than you were." Aegon said, "Humility is a good thing, Sir Jaime, and once you know that, then and only then can we bring back your arrogance." He then offered to train him and had expected to be rejected, only for Jaime to almost immediately agree. Yakon completely ignoring all other methods and instead concentrating on simply one, physically. It was true. His sword hand was always going to be stronger, and each intent he had that made him a great swordsman had been tied to that. Yakon had done his best to show him, though, that those instincts had never been lost and could be adapted, and over time, he felt it had taken hold. Dodging the strike that Jaime aimed at him, he knew it had. The smile the knight wore on his face was one of his truest ones, and though he took the day, it took longer to do so, as it had ever since they'd begun these early morning spars. In time, he'd be the best blade in their command, once more, and should he learn to use the loss of his hand to his benefit, he'd be a match, perhaps even for him. Aegon handed the sword back to Jaime and moved to pour them out the water, the two of them taking a seat as they drank it first in silence. "Where to next, Your Grace?" Jaime asked, as they sat and looked out on the immaculate gardens that surrounded the palace. "Astapor and Yunkai, Mantris, and then onto Volantis itself," he said, and Jaime looked at him worriedly. "Mantris?" Jaime asked. "We need to take all the cities, Jaime, first them and then the lands inside of Eso, and though I wish to deal with Bellico, I feel that this is what we're meant to do," he said, as he stared off in the distance. "Why, Your Grace?" Jaime asked, catching him by surprise. "Why is this what we're meant to do?" he added, and Aegon turned to look at him and found himself unable to answer for a moment before he then did so. "Because my queen wills it of us, her people will it of us. And should we not do it right this time, and we'll be fighting here for the rest of our lives. And that is not the world I'll see my daughter grow up in. She will know peace, even if it forces me to go to war with the entire known world," he said before he then swallowed the last of his water and bid Jaime follow him to break their fast. That was the simple truth of it, though it wasn't just his daughter that he wished to know peace. It was his nephew, his sisters, his wife, and even himself. He feared that should they not deal with the threats that were out there and end them now, then in time those threats would be at Regiola's door and at Robb's too. If he needed to scorch the world to see that didn't happen, then so be it. His family was all that mattered. No, that wasn't true, but it was them he would concentrate on. Was he thinking more clearly and not worrying about what he'd face when he made his way to the House of the Undying, or how fearful Dany would be that he wished to go there? Then he'd have seen what he was doing. Just as with the Night King before him, he was taking potential soldiers from Bellico's army away from him, removing them and placing them out of his reach before then dealing with the man himself. He arrived back at his rooms to find Dany up and dressed and Raxlier too awake, something that pleased him greatly as he was then able to carry her to the dragons who rested in the gardens outside their rooms. Lyrax was happier even than he to see her rider, and it was only his wife's calling for them both that stopped him from missing his morning meal and spending the rest of the day either speaking to or flying with the dragons. That and what else he needed to do today. Arya sat with Gendry and Robb, his nephew wide awake and looking around the room when he and Dany walked in. Rosaria smiled at him when she saw him carrying her niece and quickly reached over so she could hold her, his sister having eaten already. It seems. By the time he was done, they'd been joined by Lord Jon, Lady Kinvara, and Tormund. Lady Melora staying in her room and perhaps fearing his wife's words just as he was, if truth be told. Dozier ailne can we speak alone, he said softly, as his wife was laughing at something that Missandei had said to Rosia and Rhaenys. What's this about, Aegon? She asked concernedly. Not here, our room, just the two of us, he said, and she nodded and then joined him when he rose. Dany speaking to Rhaenys and Missandei and asking them to look after Rhaella for the next few moments. He held her hand as they walked, feeling how she gripped his fingers, and he hated that what he was to say would no doubt cause her more worry and concern. Her own dealings in the House of the Undying had almost cost her everything, and though she'd taken comfort that the warlocks were long since gone, he knew that a part of her feared them still. Trissler had told him that they'd tried to kill her only for Sarah Barristan to save her life, and for that they were lucky that they'd not still been here when they took the city. Had they been then, either he or Dany herself would have seen to their end. Entering the room, he saw the frown on her face, and leaned in to kiss her softly, before then leading her to the bed and sitting down beside her on it. Lady Melora came to me a few days ago. She told me something I must do, he said softly. What? What does she seek of you now? Jane said angrily, his fingers rubbing over her hand to try and calm her. I need to go to the House of the Undying, he said, and she rose to her feet, her nostrils flaring as she turned to glare at him. I forbid it, she said firmly. I forbid it, Aegon. I'll not have you go to that place. I'll burn it to the ground first. Dany, no, you have no idea of what it's like, what it does to you. No, Aegon, on this I'll not be moved, she said. And were it not for how angry she was, then he'd have laughed at how she crossed her arms in front of herself. I must go, Dany. Some things we don't get to choose. I know not what it is that awaits me there. Only that I must go and that I will be safe, and I will return, he said, as he rose and reached out to take her hand. Something she didn't allow for now. You've no idea of what it's like. Aegon, no idea of how that place messes with you. I almost lost everything there. I'll not risk losing you, Dane said, and when he wrapped his hands around her, she let him and leaned into his touch. We will have a life together, see Rhaella grow, and ride her own dragon, see the world free of slavery and tyrants. I swear to you that I'll be safe, Dany. The old gods didn't bring me back for this to be the end of things. I can't believe that. I'll not believe that, he said, and though she didn't answer, he felt she heard what he'd said. The House of the Undying 306. Aegon. It was an unremarkable building, and one that it seemed had no doors at it. The House of the Undying was a stone circular tower, and as he looked away from it, he saw the worried faces on those who'd come with him. His wife, both sisters, Tormund and the Dragon Guard, all of them looking at him concernedly. Only the ladies Melora and Kinvara were not, and he hoped that they could offer comfort to those with him that his own words had not. Closing his eyes, he told Rhaegal that he would be safe and that nothing would part him from him. His dragon flying overhead and torn between listening to him and burning this tower down. Listening winning out for now. Aegon walked over to Dany and took her in his arms. His words whispered to her as he told her that he'd be back with her and their daughter before the day was ended. With a nod to Rhaenys and Arya and a look to Tormund and Jaime that said, or at least he hoped said, that he knew what he was doing, he began to walk around the tower. The light began to fade, and it took him a moment to realize that he was indoors and not outside. The light now from candles and not from the sun. In front of him were stairs, and so he began to walk up them, soon coming to a door which he opened, and then found himself in a corridor full of doors on either side. Some were open and some were closed, and as he looked in through the open ones, he found himself looking at what seemed to be his past. The life he'd lived before he'd fallen at the wall, the life he'd lived after, both being shown clearly to him as he moved from door to door. "You know nothing, Jon Snow." Her voice was not one he'd not heard or even thought about in so many years, and the cave, not something he'd thought about in just as long. He moved from the door without taking a last look at a woman he'd thought he'd loved once. Now sure that what he'd felt for Jane to us had not been love, Dany was the only one who'd ever made him feel that way for true. "The freedom to make my own mistakes was all I ever wanted," Mance said as Jon looked at himself standing in the cells of Castle Black, and he shook his head as he had, then before moving away from it. What would it have been like had Mance lived? He wondered. Would it have changed anything at all, or would events have played out just how they had done? In the end, it mattered not, as he was here to see, and not to change. He'd already been gifted the power to do so once, and he was more than thankful for that. "Next time I see ye, you'll be all in black," Robb said. "It was always my color," Jon said with a small smile on his face. "Farewell, Snow," Robb said softly. "And you, Stark," he replied before they embraced. He felt the tears begin to fall as he moved from the door. The urge to walk inside and to grab his brother for true and hold him never to let go was strong, and it took all he had to fight it down. The time had long since passed, and though he wished more than anything that Robb was here with him, it could never be. Each door he came to showed him a different moment from his life, and it was when he reached the end of the corridor and found the door in front of him to be closed that he knew this was the one he was to walk through. Opening it, he turned to look back at the others and wiped his eyes, only for the tears to fall even more fully once he entered the door and it closed behind him. "I want to be brave," the woman said, and Jon could barely look at her, or at the man who knelt by the bed holding her hand. "You are," his uncle said as his mother shook her head. "I'm not. I don't want to die," his mother said, her tears falling as she spoke and matched by his own as he moved further into the room. "You're not going to die," his uncle said. So hard was it to look to see her lying there that he didn't hear the words she said, instead only hearing her beg his uncle to protect him and to tell him about her one day, to tell him who he was and to let him decide what his life would be, and were he not moving towards his mother, then it would be his uncle he'd be seeking out. When he reached out his hand, he was stunned to feel her own in it and to see her look at him as he knelt down by the bed. On the other side, his uncle was looking to the crib in the corner. To him, and yet Aegon could only look to his mother. "Is it you? Are you my son?" she asked, the hope in her voice, very different than the pain and worry that was there when she'd spoken to his uncle. "It is, mother, it is," he said, his voice cracking as he leaned forward to be closer to her. "Are you happy, Aegon? Are you safe?" she asked, the worry back in her voice. "I am, mother. I'm married, a father. You have a granddaughter," he said tearfully. "Then I am at peace," she said softly. Please don't go," he said, as he felt her hand loosen in his. "I loved you, Exons, your father and I. We loved you," she said, and he felt her pull him to her. The kiss she placed on his forehead, one that he'd wished for all his life, and then she breathed her last. How long he stayed there by the bed was impossible to tell. He leaned against it with his eyes closed as he sobbed, and then he may or may not have drifted off. Waking up or just coming back to his senses, he found he was alone in an empty room, and so he rose to his feet and moved to the door, opening it and walking through it to find himself once again in a corridor full of closed and open doors. Again, each room he looked into showed moments from his life. His wedding day as he dressed and made his way to the Godswood, the day he decided to end his life as he handed Longclaw to one of the younger men of the village and walked out alone from it. The night he found Ghost and lay with him on his chest, and finally he came to another locked door, and upon opening it, he then found himself looking at horses as he rode next to the man he'd thought was his father. The man he'd thought was the most honorable man who'd ever lived. "There's great honor in serving in the Night's Watch," his uncle said, not looking at him. "The Starks have manned the wall for thousands of years," his uncle added before pausing. "And you are a Stark. You might not have my name, but you have my blood." Is my mother alive? The boy on the horse asked as he stood and looked on. Knowing the answer he sought would never be given by the man he sought it from. Does she know about me, where I am, where I'm going? Does she care? The next time we see each other, we'll talk about your mother. His uncle said, I promise. He felt it then, the anger threatening to boil over, the rage that he'd felt at times in battle wishing to be unleashed. Sometimes he forced that rage back deep inside of himself, sometimes, but not now. Liar, he shouted, as loudly as he'd ever sounded. Liar, he shouted again, and he took Longclaw from its scabbard and ran at the horse that his uncle sat upon. The sword and him running at it, enough for the horse to jolt and throw his uncle from its back. Liar, he called out as she stood over his uncle with his sword in his hand, and how he didn't strike the blow he knew not. Jon? His uncle asked confusedly as he rose to his feet. Jon Snow is dead, killed by you, uncle, just as you tried to kill my family's future, he spat as his uncle looked at him. Why? Why send me here? Why not live up to that so-called honor you claim to have, he said, as he began to pace, his grip on his sword the only thing stopping him from beating his uncle to the ground with his fists. You what? Gave me a home, put a roof over my head, saved me, he asked angrily. You were my blood, his uncle said after a few moments, but never you, son. I thank the gods that never did I come from the lions of a man such as you, the man who chose his fat friend over his kin. Aegon said, his lips curling, as his disdain only grew each moment he looked at him. Robert was a fat whoremonger who looked upon my blood and named them dragon spawn. A man who, along with you and Jon Arryn, did their utmost to see my house was wiped from history. To see that the only son of my true father was placed where he could not be wed, father a child, or hold lands. Want to know how that turned out for you all? Do you, uncle? Do you? He shouted. Jon, his uncle said, and so he moved to him, the slamming of his head cracking a bone, and he enjoyed seeing the blood fall from his uncle's face as he tumbled to the ground. My name is Aegon Targaryen, he shouted, looking at his uncle as he rose to his feet unsteadily. He found himself pacing as he looked at his uncle, calming himself before he spoke again. The Baratheons are no more. None of them breathe. Uncle, the house you tried to usurp mine own with is now extinct, he said, lying somewhat. But he cared not. House Yoren is no more. They too have fallen, and the Vale has sworn to me and my wife, he said, smirking. In time the Seven Kingdoms will be part of an empire. Uncle, an empire ruled by my daughter, by the child that had you your way. I'd never have known, he said, and though his voice was composed, his anger was there and just ready to be unleashed. I never usurped you, his uncle said, and Aegon moved to him, not raising his hands or moving his sword, just moving and giving him a look that he was glad seemed to make him take a step back. Did you not? You wished for me to swear my life away and hid the truth from me, so I'd do so. You betrothed your daughter to your fat fiend's son to join your lines. Gods, if only you'd have been a woman then, you could have married the fat fuck yourself, he said, laughing a little. You led your house to doom, uncle, forced them to suffer and cost the lives of nearly everyone. One of them, in time your name will be spoken of with just as much contempt as your fat friends and or the worst of my house. You are no wolf. You never were, and it shames me that you think that I have your blood in my veins, he said as he moved to walk away. Jon, his uncle called out, and he stopped and looked back at him. What is to come to you? You deserve, and I hope the old gods see fit to punish you for what you almost cost them and me. I damn you, I name you a kinslayer, and damn you to the seven hells. You are not my blood, you are not a Stark, and you are not of the North. But the North remembers, Lord Stark, the North remembers, and Tam, you'll be remembered for who you truly were. A man with no honor. A fool who cost his house everything. He stood at a closed door and opened it without looking back. The past was where it should be in the past, and Ned Stark deserved not even one more moment of his thoughts or his time. When he walked through the door, he saw her, Dany, standing there looking worriedly, and he moved towards her. Denty, he said softly, and then he felt her arms around him, and finally the wolf was dead, and only the dragon remained. Clark's 307 AC. Dany. The wait was agonizing, and she looked sympathetically at Jorah as he waited with her. While she didn't truly fear for Ogain's well-being, he like her was magic, and he like her would not be held by this place. She did fear for his emotional state whenever he would return. Her own return from the House of the Undying had been emotionally fraught as she'd seen things she had hoped and prayed for, and even knowing they were not real, it had still taken her some time to get over them. Had she not had to fight her way from the Warlock's grasp and foiled their plans, then it may have taken her even longer. She didn't wish for Aegon to have to fight his way out, and had been assured he would not. While the power the Warlocks called upon was still strong in this place, they themselves were long gone. Melora and Kinvara both telling her so, and the former telling her that Aegon needed to do this. As she waited, she looked to her good sisters, both of whom were staring daggers at the Lady Melora. Should it come to pass that Aegon was harmed, Dany was sure it would be Arya and Rhaenys who saw to the lady's end. Long before she did, of the Dragon Guard it was Ser Jorah and Ser Jaime who looked the most concerned. Jorah because he knew more of this place than any other than her, and Jaime because he and her husband had formed a bond of sorts. They were not quite friends, certainly not in the same way as Aegon and Tormund were, but they were getting there, so much so that it was that more than anything else which had turned her opinion of Jaime Lannister around. The name he shared with his father and his brother turning out to be a bigger obstacle to her own acceptance of him than his actions ever truly were. Tormund, God's what she'd give to have his faith and confidence in Aegon's return. The man is always speaking simply and directly to any who asked him. Not even death can hold. Jon Snow, how the fuck is a building going to? It had brought a smile to her face, and though it had been the last one she had worn over the last few hours, she welcomed it all the same. As time stretched on, she began to resolve to enter the building herself, to seek her husband out and take him from that place. Her worries starting to grow and prey on her mind, and just when she thought she could take no more, she heard his voice and felt his arms around her. Aegon said as he kissed her cheek repeatedly. My love, he whispered in her ear as he held her tightly to his chest. You are well, unhurt? She asked as she moved from him to look him over. I am well, my love. Truly, he said, leaning forward to kiss her lips. The kiss was soft, yet it and the look in his eyes promised so much more, and she felt keen to get back to the palace. Aegon, Rhaenys said, running to her brother and beating Arya for once. Aegon embracing first one sister and then the other when Rhaenys stepped back so Arya could take her place. He reached out and took her hand, Rhaenys and Arya walking close beside them, and Dany looked to see Jorah relax somewhat, and Jaime let out a relieved breath. When her eye caught Lady Melora, she gave the woman a small nod, which she felt showed her own feelings clearly. Something that seemed to work, if the small smile on the lady's face was anything to go by. Tormund just wore the biggest grin ever, and though he waited until they reached the palace before he grabbed Aegon in a bear hug, that was all he waited for. I fucking told them, no walls can hold you, Jon Snow, not even the biggest fucker that were ever built. Tormund said as he lifted Aegon into the air. The Dany was not the only one who was laughing as Aegon pretended to fight to get free from the larger man's arms. Rosier and even the Dragon Guard smiled, and it was only Missandei stepping forward with Rhaega that had Tormund let him down so quickly. Fuck off, you fool, and let me hold someone. I wish to. Aegon said, chuckling as he moved to take their daughter in his arms. Yes, you're right. I should have left him on the other side of the wall. How did you get to be so clever, little dragon? Aegon said as he side-eyed Tormund and looked down at Rhaenyra. As Aegon walked into the palace, Dany turned to the others and told them they'd speak later. She knew that both his sisters wished to know what it was he'd seen, as did she, but she for now wished to be alone with her husband, even more than that. Once they'd agreed and Ordea had seen Gendry holding their own babe, Dany hurried after Aegon and caught up with him just as he was about to enter their rooms. She opened the door for him herself and followed in behind him. Aegon then taking a seat on the floor and Ghost moving to lick his hand as he did so, Rilla quickly putting out her own hand to the wolf and then giggling when she too had her hand licked. I'm well, boy. Aegon said as he looked into Ghost's red eyes, and the wolf after a moment moved away and lay down nearby, close but not too close. She took her seat on the floor beside him and waited for him to bring up what he saw. Only to find for the next hour or so, it was the last thing he wished to talk about. Instead, he played with Rosea and had her join in, both of them doing their utmost to make their daughter laugh and Daddy smiling broadly each time she did so. Listening to Aegon as he called their daughter a little dragon and spoke to her as if he was telling tales or even having a conversation that she was taking part in was something to behold. Each little gurgle or sound Rosea made being answered by Aegon, as is, she was speaking plainly. I know, little dragon. No, the wall was no place to name your home. I am happy it's no longer mine too, else I'd not know you. No, nothing in this world would ever make me not wish for you, little dragon. Nothing. She looked at Egwene's face as she spoke, and he never frowned, never looked annoyed or angry. Other than when they lay together, she'd never seen him look as peaceful and content as he did right now. The closest he came to looking even slightly put out was when Rhaella began to drift to sleep. Dany wondering if he'd wished for her to stay awake longer, and believing that to be the case when he picked Rhaella up and laid her down in her crib, Aegon then standing over it and looking down as their daughter fell completely to sleep, and only after a few moments did he move away. "Aegon," she said as he walked towards her and took a seat beside her on the floor. "I'm good, Dany, truly. I saw and did what I needed, and I feel no upset or concern. I feel better than I have in the longest time," Aegon said as he reached out to take her hand. "How I feel with you, with Rhaxley. I feel that way now and here," he added as he touched his heart. "It's free of anything but good, Dany. My heart is finally at peace." The chance to ask him more didn't come right away. His kisses and how he carried her to bed saw to that. It was only after they'd lain together and her head was resting on his chest that she felt he'd speak. So lifting her head up, she looked into his eyes and asked him what he'd seen. "Yogon, what?" "Saw my life, Dany, my true life, and not with the misconceptions I had of it. I saw pieces and moments that I wished I could change, and that I'd perhaps have handled differently had I known the truth. My brother, I saw my brother, and I knew it then, as I've always known it." Aegon said, with a smile on his face she'd rarely seen him wear. "Knew what, Aegon?" she asked. "That he was true, that he was always true, and not like the others. Rue was not Sansa, not Bran. He was not my uncle. He was my brother, and I loved him as much as he did me." Aegon said, and she touched his face, seeing him close his eyes. "I saw my mother, Dany. I spoke to her. I told her about you and about our daughter." Dany gasped, so shocked was he that he had done so, and yet she really shouldn't have been. Her words as she spoke them were then ones she didn't even think about before speaking. "She was happy, for you, for us," she asked, and Aegon nodded before kissing her softly. "She was. I believe she was," Aegon said, and Dany smiled as she brushed her hand against his cheek. "What else, Aegon? There was more, wasn't there?" she asked, and saw his eyes darken. And then it was gone so quickly that she began to doubt she'd ever seen it. "I saw my uncle, heard the promise he made my mother, and the depth of the lie he told me only became even more true. He knew what she wished for me, he knew, and because it didn't fit in with his love for his brother by choice, he cared not," Aegon said. Yet his words weren't bitter or angry, which surprised her. "Oh, Aegon, my love," she said as she moved to embrace him. I gotta tell him what I felt about all he'd done. To tell him what his path had led to, and that it was not his friend's line that would sit the throne. He helped him usurp from our house, not his grandchildren, that would be named princes, princesses, or kings and queens. He failed. Robert failed. Jon Arryn failed. Bay Tywin, Lannister, Stannis, Renly, all of them failed because they forgot one thing when they looked to King's Landing and to the Iron Throne. They forgot who forged it, who built that city, and that dragons rule over all," Aegon said, and Dany felt a stirring in her chest at his words. "They do," she said determinedly, as she looked at him, and she swore she could see the fire behind his eyes. "The Ossos will find it out soon enough too, my love. They'll look out their windows or from high above their walls, and they'll see us when we come, and finally they'll know the truth." "The truth?" she asked eagerly. "Aye, we are dragons, Dany, and we've not come to play." Aegon said, Wintertown 3007 AC. Sansa. It hadn't improved her life, her reception when she left the room, or how she was treated. If anything, over the last few moons, the only change had been that she'd put on weight. So much so that when she had finally noticed as she looked in the looking glass, it had then led her to cry for hours. She had taken comfort in food, in the extra portions, and the addition of sweets and fruits. Even lemon cakes occasionally had been amongst the parcels delivered to her. And though at first she'd refused to eat them, seeing them as a sign of mockery, eventually her sweet tooth won out. When she'd finally noticed just how she looked, they and other such things were soon removed from her meals. They still were delivered, but no longer did she act a giddy little girl and delight in them being so. Now, when she saw them, she would almost throw them away, though instead she'd found something else to do with them. The children accepting them as all children always would, as she herself would have even were she back in Winterfell, where she belonged. It had been her one vice. The addition of a lemon cake with her meal had always been seen as a reward for her. A way for her mother or father to show how special she truly was. Now it was, or at least she felt that it was, a way to show how she was anything but. Each day she'd wake up and realize just how far she'd fallen, the room seeming to get smaller and smaller to her, the longer she stayed in it. The clothes she wore always feeling as if they were beneath someone of her stature, which they were, and were worn for comfort rather than how a dress worn by Sansa Stark should be. She'd look at herself in the looking glass and sigh, as she would see how her hair had lost its luster, the small lines beginning to form on her face, and feel how age was beginning to creep in. Sansa had just reached her 22nd year, and each time she looked at herself, she felt as if she was far older, as if she'd lived far longer than she had, and she feared what more time in this place and life would do to her. With no position, no prospects, and no stature, all she had was her looks, and if they faded, then her life was done for. This would be the only life she knew, and she would rather die than for that to be the case. Taking her own life was something she had considered more than once since this unjust sentence had been forced upon her. Yet she could not give in. She'd not give in. Picking up her threadbare cloak, she then gathered the previous day's deserts and made her way from the room, eager to speak to the children and hear what they had to say. Varys had used his own little birds, and so Sansa had tried to do the same. "Lady Sansa," a young boy called out as she left the building that her room was in, he and the others waiting for her and well used to her routine by now. "Garth, Mara," she said as if she was happy to see them, her false smile now used to beguile children rather than the lords, ladies, and knights they should be used on. "Do you have sweets, my lady?" Mara called out as she always did each day, the little girl fearful that perhaps one day she'd not. "Course I do, Miara," she said, seeing the young girls smile, and she bid them follow as she made her way to the quiet, secluded area behind the open street. It was the one place she could get away from the stares and glares most people sent her way. The first few times she'd shared her desserts with the children, their families had taken them from away her and forbidden them from speaking to her. Over time, the children had found a way, and their families had, while not being happy about the time they spent with her, had allowed them to. Not that she spent any more time in the wretch's company than she needed to, just enough for them to tell her all she needed to know and for her to ingratiate herself with them. Over time, it had become clear to her why Varys had used little children for his spies. They were unwatched, and almost shadows to those older than they. No one paid attention to them, as they listened and learned their secrets, and she wished now that along with playing the dutiful sister and welcoming host, when the dragon whore and her bastard brother had come to Winterfell, she'd have used the children too. "No, you share. There is some for all of you," she said, trying not to lose her temper with them as she handed out a piece of candied fruit to each of them and the lemon cake to Maradier. "Thank you, Lady Sansa. Thank you," Mara said happily, as she smiled at her, and even her unfeeling heart was touched, a little by the girl's sincerity. As they ate, they talked, and Sansa listened, finding nothing of note until Mara herself was finished, and she told her about the men who'd arrived in the town a day or so ago. Men who stayed in the inn and who were not from the north. Sansa listening eagerly as Mara named them as windmen, something she didn't understand until one of the other children said, "Men of the storm." She tried to recall all she knew about the Stormlands, and then wondered if these men were sent from Gendry, as was he not in charge of the Stormlands now. It made no sense to her why he'd send someone to Wintertown, though, and after she asked Mara to point the men out, she for some reason began to believe they were not sent by the bastard Smith after all. A part of her dared to believe they were here for her, but as she watched them make their way to Winterfell, she knew they were not. They were simply men who'd come to speak to the Lord of Winterfell, and didn't really understand that Ed was simply a figurehead who held no power. There was no trade deal to negotiate or alliance to be made with him. It would be Mage Mormont or Wyman Manderley that they'd need to see for that. When the knock came to her door that night, it caught her by surprise. Her food parcel had arrived earlier, and she'd just eaten her meal and was ready for bed. Hurriedly dressing, or at least covering herself up, she made her way to the door to find the men from the Stormlands standing in front of her. Seeing them so clearly showed them to be knights, warriors, and she was fearful of inviting them inside. When they told her they'd been sent from their lord specifically to speak to her, Sansa took a deep breath and tried not to seem too keen before inviting them in. "Your lord, good sir," she asked as she took a seat. "Lord Edric Baratheon, my lady." It took her 3 days to organize her departure. Sansa knew she was being watched and that she'd be stopped from leaving should it ever cross her mind. It had on many occasions, and yet it wasn't being watched that had stopped her. It was how she'd survive on the road and where she'd go once she had left, which kept her a prisoner in the small, cramped room. With knights who were well supplied and with a destination to head to, it was a different matter. So she told them that Jon had placed guards and restrictions on her, that after he'd stolen her birthright from her, he'd then ensured she could not leave or seek aid to take back what was hers, and they'd listened intently and told her they'd come up with a plan. At the hour of the owl on the third night, wearing dark clothes and with her hair covered, she snuck away from the room, and Sir Andrew helped her through the town and to the waiting horses. Within hours they were gone, and though they'd be followed, they'd not truly be. A week later they reached the stony shore, and as she boarded the ship and it set sail, saw Sansa standing on deck and wearing one of the truest smiles she'd worn in more than a year. An alliance with a lord who held an army and sought what she wished for. Finally, she had a chance to gain what should be hers, to be who she should be, and she would grasp it with both hands. The game had started once again, and this time she was more ready for it and wouldn't make the mistakes she had before. This time she'd win, and it would be others who fell, and some who lost their lives. Astapor 307 AC. Brienne. Purpose. It was what she'd spent her entire life searching for. Even more so than respect or acceptance, though she'd wished for both, it had been to find a purpose she'd longed for. A reason as to why she'd been born, why she was, how she was, and different than almost every other woman she'd known. Almost every other woman she thought as she took the day's lesson with Arya Stark, the young woman just like her, had not been willing to be what the world thought she should, and they'd become firm friends because of it. "Now hold it up, Raimi," Azaradia said a while later, as Brienne handed the queen her mug of water. "I was holding it up," Rosiane said, exasperatedly. "Hold it up, better then," Ardia said, smirking as the queen swallowed her water hungrily. "Again, sire," the queen said once she'd done so, and Brienne nodded as they moved back to spar once again. Had someone told her that she'd earn a knighthood, then she'd have laughed at them. Were they then to tell her she'd wear a white cloak? It may have been a blow she aimed at them for teasing her so. If they continued to speak and told her she'd serve a queen and king that she believed in with all her heart, that at times she'd guard a princess that was one day to be a dragon rider and the empress of lands both east and west, she'd have named them fools and sought better and truer company. Yet, all of that was true, and it had led her to find the true purpose of her life. This was who she was meant to be and who she had always wished to be. Each day she woke was one that she faced eagerly. Every single moment she spent serving the king and queen or guarding the princess was one that she relished. Her talks with those she served with were the ones she'd hoped for more than anything, to be treated as an equal, looked at on her merits and not her sex, and accepted for who she truly was. That had been something she'd not even dared to dream for. "Ready, sir," the queen said as she held up her thin blade and moved towards her. "I am, your grace," she said as she smiled at her queen. It had been the king who'd come and asked her, and his sister to train the queen and the princess. Brienne was only too willing to do so, while Arya had said that neither would ever be true swordswomen. King Aegon, though, hadn't cared, and had told his sister that both would perhaps surprise her. What he wished for was not that they could wield a blade as well as Arya or she herself could, but that they could wield it well enough to protect themselves should it need to be done. Brienne knew he gave both of them lessons too, as did Ser Jorah. What he truly wanted, though, was for them to find a style that suited them best, and in that her queen had left her shocked, stunned, and incredibly proud. Given her stature, Brienne had expected the queen to need to learn the water dancing that Arya was so proficient in, that it would be speed and movement that she'd excel in, and yet it was more her style that the queen seemed adept in. So it was mainly Brienne that trained her, while Arya focused more on the princess. "Well done, your grace," she said as the queen landed a hit on her that she hadn't been able to dodge, Brienne not needing to look to the side to see the king looking on proudly as he held the princess in his arms. She did hear the laugh from the princess as the king said something to her, and she saw the smile on her queen's face as she knew that she was being spoken about glowingly. Brienne had been lucky enough to have heard some of the things that King Aegon would say as he held his daughter in his arms and watched the queen go through stances, or when it was Ser Jorah teaching her a move or two. "Aye, little dragon, your mother is fierce." "Of course she scares me. Only a fool wouldn't fear a dragon such as your mother." "Aye, you too will be just as fierce as her when you grow. You'll be training from much earlier, my love, much earlier." It hadn't just been his wife that the king spoke so glowingly about. His sister, too, he showed great pride in, and for Brienne, it only made her respect the king even more. Not that she had not respected him for the longest time. Ever since she'd met him in Castle Black and seen what he'd done from then on, he'd earned her respect. At Winterfell during and after the long night, even more so. And since he'd stepped out of that strange building in Korth, Brienne had noticed a change come over him. Axland was a serious man. At times a man who had brooded too much, and yet from when he had arrived in Winterfell until now, it had become lesser over time. Now it was as rare to find him brooding as it had once been to find a smile on his face. Whatever he'd seen and done in that place had seemed to lift a weight from him, and it was something she was not alone in appreciating. Even the red-headed wilding saying that the king was finally learning to love life and that it was long overdue. "Yield, Cyril," she heard and looked to see the sword at her neck, her distracted thoughts having cost her the match, and as she yielded, she began to smile when the queen curtsied to the sound of the king clapping. Brienne, looking up to see him move the princess's hands together and for her then to try and do so herself. With the day done, she readied for the night ahead. They would eat and rest, and she and all the Dragon Guard would need to sleep tonight, as they'd be on duty on the morrow. The city they'd come here to take would fall. The only question was how quickly and how dangerous the fight to take it would truly be. She hoped it would not be, and that neither her queen and princess would need to yield a blade for a long time to come. The queen and princess sparred twice a day. The king, she knew, did so just as much, if not more. Ever since they'd readied to leave course, it had been their routine. While sailing, it had been stances, forms, getting used to carrying and wielding a blade without actually sparring. Since they landed and marched, it had been each day, and by the time they reached Volantis, her work would be done. From then on, it would be more to stay in shape and keep their rhythm. That the sparring would be used for, until then, it was still to train them both. After eating her meal and bidding the king, queen, and princess a good night, she made her way to her tent and was asleep moments after her head hit the pillow. Waking early the next morning, she affixed her armor and made her way to the king and queen's tent, finding Ser Jaime already there, and Ser Jorah to be inside. They broke their fast and marched, reaching the city's gates by mid-afternoon, and as Lord Jon had the army from up, she took her place with Ser Jaime at the princess and Missandei's side, the White Wolf acting their third. "Do you believe we'll see a true battle today, Ser Jaime?" she asked, and the knight shook his head. "His grace does not expect one, nor does the Lady Melora," Sarkshan Jaime said, and she prayed he was right. Later that night, they settled into the pyramid that had been provided to them by the remnants of the good masters, all of whom had knelt not when they saw the army that was camped outside their gates, but at the sight of the 4 dragons, 3 with riders on their back. She stood guard outside the king and queen's chambers, and she blushed at the sounds that came from behind the door. Brienne smiling, though, at the thoughts of another prince or princess, and hoping beyond hope that in time she'd serve Empress Rala, just as she did her mother and father. It was the true purpose of her life, after all. Yonkai 3007 AC. Rosiangs, having Dieru, Nahor is appointed to be amongst those who guarded her, was not something she'd sought, and not something she'd wished for. Ringsu was sure he'd annoy her greatly. She'd expected him to be much too forward, as Arya and Missandei both had warned her about how he was prone to act. Yet she had found the man to be respectful, if a little irreverent. Something that she'd come to appreciate, just as much as she knew her brother did. Protocol was not a thing she'd truly been brought up with, and while she understood the need for it with those who were not in their immediate circle, she, like Aegon, far preferred not to have to deal with it with those who were. Over time, she'd found the reason for Dariur's apparent change in manners, his affair with Yadier Greyjoy surprising Dariur and even Aegon when she'd told them about it. Though they'd both welcomed the happiness, it seemed, the two had brought to each other. It had made her slightly jealous, though. Not that she wished for Dariur to be more than what he was, but that she herself did not have someone in her life who made her happy in that way. Her upset was picked up on first by Aegon and then by the Lady Melora, and the conversations she'd had with both of them still brought a smile to her face, though a different smile for each. I find I much prefer my sister not having a man in her life, Aegon said as they sat by the dragons, and she turned to speak angrily to him, only to see the small smile on his face, and to then hear the rest of his words. I've no desire to gut the man who dared think himself good enough for her. Aegon added, and she leaned forward and placed a kiss on his cheek. A man like my brother, surely there is another just as true as you out there, she asked, almost desperately. A man who makes you smile and whose heart stills when he looks upon you. Aye, should you find such a man, I'll deem him worthy, Eaxen. Perhaps, he added, and she punched his shoulder lightly. With Lady Melora it was the same, but more cryptic, and yet she offered up a better promise than perhaps. You'll find what your heart seeks in Volantis, my princess, a man much like your brother and true of intent, a man you already know. Her words had forced her to think on all those she knew, and to not be able to find one who she could even consider that way. That almost making her dismiss them only for the faith her brother put in the lady, making her reconsider. Perhaps she was right, and it made her eager to travel on to Volantis, to have the other cities they needed to take first all fall as easily as Astapor had. When the good masters had knelt so quickly, she'd been disappointed almost. A large part of her wishing to use Balerion in battle then and there, so he and she would be ready for the harder battles to come. Now she hoped that Yunkai and Mantaris would kneel just as easily. The wise masters, Dario, what can you tell me of them? She asked as they made their way to the dragons. Wise in name and not nature, princess. If what the good master said is true, then there are fewer of them today than there once was, the Dario said. And she nodded. Do you believe they'll kneel? She asked, and heard him laugh. Fools though they may be, they like those in a stable know when to kneel and when to fight. Today will not be a day for fighting, princess, Derosier said, and she hoped he was right. When they reached the dragons, she looked to see Aegon and Dany already there, both of them softly stroking their dragon snouts, while Aegon softly rubbed the red dragons too. She moved to Balerion and rubbed his own snout just as softly, hearing his trill and feeling him move his head closer to her, as her hand moved over the bright blue scales. The little specks of red he had were on the underneath of his wings and between his horns. Apart from them, Balerion was as blue as the sky, and unable to be seen once he flew against it. Elon Sovagon, Balerion, Elon Sovagon, Sarcostilis Tubiel Magagon, Sirier, Perzis. We fly, Balerion, we fly, and perhaps today you bring them fire, she said. Are you ready, big sister? Aegon said as he moved behind her, his arms going around her when she turned to him. I am. Dario says you don't expect a fight today, she asked curiously once he let her go. Lady Melora believes they'll kneel, Aegon said, and she looked at him to see that he believed it too. Then we shouldn't keep them waiting, should we? She said with a laugh as he pushed against her shoulder, and she did it back to him. As she climbed up onto Balerion's back, she saw Aegon kiss his wife, and then he and Dany both mounted their dragons. With one look to her, all 4 dragons took to the air and flew over their army that had surrounded the city, Crumma leading the Dothraki and Grey Worm, Ser Jorah and Lord Jon leading the rest. Some distance away, almost 200 unsullied and 1,000 Dothraki guarded a tent along with Ser Jov, Mesarbrian and Ghost, while inside Arja, Missandei, Gendry, Robb, and Reshiala all waited for the signal to come to the city. That should have been enough of a sign that her brother truly felt no worry about a fight today. Had he believed there to be one coming, then her niece would be far from here, and aboard a ship. As they landed near but out of arrow range of the city, she looked to the gates and saw the riders approaching them, and bearing the flag of parley. It was a surprise to see a woman lead the way, and she looked to Axon to see if he was aware of this, her brother showing no sign that he was not. They didn't climb down off the dragons, didn't move even when the riders dismounted. My name is Malaza. Some have named me the Girl General. The lady who was dressed in armor and seemed to be the one in charge began, On behalf of the wise masters of Yunkai, we welcome Queen Daenerys and King Aegon to our great city, and we pledge ourselves in Yunkai to you both, Malaza said as she and those with her knelt. Rosierne smiled to see it, no doubt just as she had in Astapor. Here she'd hear of Bellico once more and why they were so willing to kneel without a fight. Perbibias Mirin, Korth Astapor, and Yunkai. In less than a year, her brother niece and she herself had seen the lands controlled by her house expanded upon. The great cities of Essos had fallen far more easily than she had ever expected they would, and her father's prophecy was proving ever more true. Northios 307 AC. Arianne, spending time with her mother had been as it always was. A pleasure, which was far more than she could say about the rulers of this city. The bearded priests wanted the security her army brought to the city, but not their presence. And ever since they'd arrived, the whispers had begun. How much they ate, how many of them there were, how long they'd be staying for. The questions she could deal with and let slide. Comments about her men and disparaging remarks. She could and would not. The men of Dorne had come at her command and at her mother's behest. They'd come to offer aid against a man who'd already sought to take 2 of the kingdoms in Westeros and more than 1 city in Essos. A man who was more than willing to pull on a dragon's tail and who the people of Norvos rightly feared, yet they had no true army to protect them, no real force, and unlike with the Dothraki, when they would come to attack the city, gold wouldn't buy him off. For moons, the discontent over their presence had risen. The words spoken up against them had grown louder, and even she and her mother had argued. Malaria was torn between being a good Norvisi and her mother who'd sought her aid. In the streets, scuffles had broken out between her men and the men and women of Norvisi, and it was only that she had bid them to that had stayed her men's hands. She was beginning to fear that it was soon to come to a head, and either the Norvisi or some of her men would not be able to control themselves unless Bellico's intent was made clear. As she stood looking out on the night sky, the slip she wore feeling uncomfortable in the warm air, she sighed and was ready to return to her bed when she felt Daemon's arms wrap around her. "My princess cannot sleep?" Daemon asked softly as she leaned back into his comforting arms. "I both wish the fight had already come and welcome that it has not," she said with a bitter laugh. "I must admit I prefer it has not, though I believe our men a match for any. I would much rather have the king, queen, and their dragons with us." Arianne said, and Arianne nodded. "As would I," she said as Daemon led her back to bed. She woke for true a few hours later, and broke her fast with her mother, and no sooner had she sat down and begun to eat, than the talk turned to the same place her thoughts had been earlier, though it seemed that it was much worse than she feared, and she looked at her mother incredulously as she spoke. "The council met with the bearded priests last night. I believe a declaration decrying your presence is soon to be made," her mother said, and Arianne looked at her, her head uncovered this morning, as the wig she sometimes wore was elsewhere. "Were they to do such a thing? It would leave me with no choice, mother," she said as she watched her mother touch her head, her fingers stroking its baldness in what she had come to know as her mother's nervous tick. "You cannot leave, Ari," her mother said worriedly. "If the bearded priests make such a decree, what choice would I have? My men are here as protectors, as invited guests, and you know full well what such a decree would lead to. Already your people bristle at our presence. I'll not allow that to become more than simple harsh looks or loud whispers," she said, her appetite leaving her. "He will come, Ari. He will come, and Norvos will fall," her mother said pleadingly. "Then convince those who truly rule here what their words will bring about," she said, and her mother nodded. It took her until it was time for luncheon before her anger had subsided enough to allow her to break her fast. Her mother had left and headed to the temple to speak to the magisters, who in turn would speak to the bearded priests, and the feeling at the pit of Arianne's stomach that she'd be unsuccessful was growing all the while. After she'd eaten, she met with her generals, and then with Ned Dane. But finding herself surprised that it was the Lord of Starfall who'd requested a meeting with her before she had a chance to do so first. Feeling annoyed and eager to be distracted from her thoughts, she and Daemon, along with Ario and her guards, made their way through the city to where Ned was staying. The words she heard along the way angering her even more, and by the time she got to his manse, she was furious. Were it not for Daemon noticing and taking her hand, she may have not been able to calm herself before entering the manse itself. As it was, his endeavors had only worked somewhat, and it was the young lord's easygoing manner that managed to do the rest. "Princess, sir," Ned said with a smile, which put them both at ease. "Ned, what have I told you?" she asked, with a questioning look on her face, her eyebrow raised, and though she was not smiling, it was there beneath the surface. "Forgive me, Arianne," Ned said, and as they were led to a table, her smile now no longer hidden. "You wish to speak to me, Ned?" she asked. "I did," I'd have come to you, Arianne. There was no need for you, Ned said, and she interrupted him with a wave of her hand. I wish for the walk, Ned. It did me good to get out and about and hear how welcome my presence and those of our army truly is, she said, biddingly. It's about that I wish to speak, Arianne. This arrived this morning, brought to me by a bird at my window. Not a raven, but an eagle bearing that note, Ned said, handing her a note, his expression different now as there seemed to be an eagerness about him for her to read it. Taking it from his hand, she opened it up and read the words which confused her. A request and not order to come to Volantis that was written in a hand she knew not and was signed by the Lady Melora rather than the king or queen. Arianne? Ned asked, worried by her expression. How do we know this is from the Lady Melora? She asked, and Ned shook his head. I've considered that. I thought at first it may be one of the Norvosi. Someone trying to get us to leave by sending us on a false errand. Or even this Bellico fellow, seeking for us to abandon Norvos and thereby make it easier for him to capture it. Now you think not? Daemon asked. Their Grace's plans were Meereen, the Bay of Dragons, and then Volantis, Daemon. I believe they'd achieved or are close to achieve the first of those things, and seek our aid in the last, Ned said, and his words made sense, something that Daemon agreed with given the look on his face. We're to aid Norvos, Ned. It's why we sailed here, instead of joining their Graces. Were we to just abandon the city? She began, only for Daemon to interrupt. We may not have a choice, Ari, Daemon said, looking at her. My men and I await your word, Princess. We stand by your side and your decision, Ned said, making her smile, return. Even though he'd resorted back to formality. In a way, he'd had to as he was speaking to her then, as the Princess of Dorne, and so she welcomed it, and after asking if he or his men needed anything and what he felt was the mood of her army, she then bid him farewell for now and made her way back to her mother's manse, only to find it was elsewhere that she was bid to go. No amount of arguing from her mother had made the slightest difference, and if anything it had angered and turned feelings against them even more. The proud magisters not liking being told what to, unless it was by those they had to listen to, and the bearded priests themselves were obstinate and insulting. In 3 days she was ready to march away from this city, and it was only the fact that Ned Dane had received the message he had that it was not back to Dorne. She was headed, instead, it was to be Volantis. And as she saw Norvos fade in the distance and knew she was leaving it to its fate, she cared not. Partly because they had not truly wished her there, mainly because the woman she had truly come to save was now marching with them. What are the dragons like, Ari? Her mother asked excitedly. Fierce, mother. The dragons are fierce. Arianne replied, and it was not the ones that flew in the air that she was speaking of. Coca 3007 AC. Sam, he was laying in a bed filled with his own mess. A bed whose sheets were still wet from the sweat and piss he found himself covered in each morning. In the corner, the bucket where he relieved himself had long since overflowed, and the stench was something he barely even noticed anymore. It had only been a few days, and yet to Sam it had felt a lifetime. Hearing the door open, he shrunk in on himself to become as small as he could, not offer them a target to strike, and was relieved to find it was food and not a beating he was to receive. There had been far more of the latter than the former since he'd been thrown into this cell. As he hungrily ate the almost rotten fruit and piece of stale bread and drank down water that was far less clean than it should be, he wondered how he'd not seen this coming. Was he truly a fool? Had he been so wrapped up in a sense of his own importance that he'd not considered how little he actually mattered? Was he so afraid of Jon Snow that he had walked into the hands of someone even more dangerous? No, on the last of those he had not been wrong. Sam knew full well that there was no one more dangerous than Jon Snow. He took what comfort that he could from that, and the hope that just as always, it would be Jon who came to his rescue. As he had from the bullies at Castle Black, from Thorne, and from the life he'd have been forced to live there, were he not his friend. Or had he not at least pretended to be. Jon would come, he'd come and take him from this place, and though it would more than likely lead to his death, regardless, it would at least be a quick one. Something he feared with Bellico he was not going to be lucky enough to receive. After he'd eaten, he lay back down in his own filth. The bed, though wet and full of his own smell, was far more comfortable than the floor, and Sam had always liked his comforts. It had been them which had gotten him into this mess after all. The chance of more having robbed him of his senses, and he cursed his gluttony nature. Had he just been content with what he had, with Gilly and the life they could lead, had he not sought more than he earned, then he'd be far from this place. As it was, he knew it likely that he'd never leave this city, and never see Gilly again. I'm sorry. By the seven, I'm sorry. Father, please help me, he cried out as he pulled the wet blanket over himself and tried to sleep. Each night had been a variation on the theme. Father Smith, warrior, mother, maiden, crone, and stranger. He'd prayed to them all. To them. To the old gods. To Rockler. And even the many-faced and drowned gods. He prayed to any who'd listen and begged them to take him from this place. He begged forgiveness and willed them to send Jon to him, to send him and the Dragon Queen and their dragons. And he'd sworn if they did, then he'd change. That were they to just rescue him from his fate, he could change. There was no answer because, unlike Jon Snow and very much like Aegon Targaryen, the gods could see deep inside of him, and they knew his true nature. Jon Snow may come and rescued him because Jon Snow knew nothing. Sam had no faith whatsoever that Aegon Targaryen would even try, and each day he stayed here. It was a day closer to his end. That day finally arriving far sooner than he had expected, and again he wondered how he'd not seen it coming. The meals he'd been given were more like the ones he'd once eaten regularly. Clothing had been brought to him so he could be allowed to change, and he'd even been allowed to wash. Fool that he was, he actually thought it meant that Jon was near, that they would seek to trade him so they didn't have to face a dragon's wrath. When the truth was far more simple, it was his time to die. "Where are you taking me?" he asked nervously, as the guards pushed him through the corridors and out into the large courtyard. "Move or we make you move," a particularly ugly guard said, and Sam did as he was bid, knowing full well that this was one of the worst of those who'd been left to watch over him, a cruel man who delighted in hearing him cry out in pain. He was moved through streets where men and women all walked in the same direction as he did, and he wondered what was going on. When he saw the raised platform and the two poles a few feet apart, he tried to stop moving. The smack he got to the back of his head and the threat of more soon making him move again. His cowardice knew no bounds, and even knowing he was facing his end, he couldn't summon up the courage to fight. Not even when they tied his arms to the poles could he do anything to stop them. So paralyzed was he by fear. "We come here today to bear witness to a new beginning, a new light, a new path for all of us," a bearded man said as Bellico walked up some steps and joined him on the platform. "Behold the chosen, the high priest of the Church of Starry Wisdom and heir to the Bloodstone throne, the Bloodstone Emperor Reborn." The man said to loud cheers, and Sam tried to twist his head to see who he was speaking of, only to find it was Bellico and to feel a fool yet again. "The blood moon calls for a sacrifice, and one has been chosen. Watch and watch closely, and see what true power looks like," Bellico said as he stood forward, and Sam noticed the knife in his hand and felt his bladder loosen. Bellico began to cut away at the clothing that Sam wore, taking his time, and the blade he bore in his hand never once touched his skin until it did. Sam screaming out loudly as the man he had thought would help him against Aegon Targaryen and the Dragon Queen proved to be no friend of his. Firstly taking his nipple before taking what felt like a pound of flesh as he held up what had been one of his flabby teats. He felt the water as it was thrown over him, and he awoke to find that he'd not be allowed the comfort of passing out, and then he felt the blade once more as his other nipple and teat was removed. "Erase, please, please," he cried out, and all he received was loud cheers, as Bellico continued about his work. As he tried to struggle against the ropes that held him, Bellico began to carve things into his stomach, symbols and images that he couldn't see. He felt them, though. Or, to be more precise, he felt each line that he drew and each pass of the knife as it cut into his skin. Then he screamed out once more when he felt Bellico take his stones in one hand and move the knife towards them. "No, I know. No, I know." He prayed to pass out again, but there was no one listening, and so Sam looked on in horror as Bellico cut away and then held his stones in his hand. The two balls looking far smaller than he had ever imagined them to be, and when he felt the man's hand on his stem, he shook his head vigorously. Not that it stopped him or dissuaded him from what he wished to do, and so far quicker than he imagined such a task could be accomplished in, he was unmanned for true. To see them there, his stones and stem laying on what looked like a plate, was terrifying. To think the thoughts he had in his head as Bellico raised the plate and looked at him wickedly was even worse. "Don't worry, Sam. I'll not feed them to you," Bellico said with a laugh as he moved to a bowl that seemed to be a light and fed Sam's manhood to the fire. The colors of the flames changed as first his stones and then his stem burned away to nothing. Bright orange, vivid yellow, vibrant green, and finally a red of a like that he'd never seen before. Sam looked on as it seemed to float in the air above the bowl, and then drifted into the sky. The red almost looking to be everywhere as it floated above Belito, him and the crowd, and he thought he'd lost his mind, lost all senses as it moved towards and then covered the moon. "Now to work," Belito said as he moved towards him, and Sam felt him cutting away at his body, the pain going so far beyond anything he'd ever managed, and his screams were loud until they were not. It was very hard to scream without a tongue, and that had been taken from him a few moments or a few hours ago. He knew not which, only that he'd watched as it was thrown into the crowd and had looked on in horror as a man and woman had shared it, each of them eating what looked to him to be an equal amount. On and on his suffering went. Bellico somehow knowing what to cut to make him hurt even more, and Sam finding more about his body in his last moments than he ever had in all the time that came before them. Ears hurt more than a nose, fingers more than toes, the muscle at the back of his calf was a pink and shriveled thing, and the one at the back of his thigh was a sickly-looking pale white. He had more flesh than he had ever truly imagined, and even after taking handful after handful, there was still so much more to be removed. Blood loss didn't lead to death, even though it should, and the moon in the sky was a red one and had risen far too soon. When he lost his eyes, he welcomed it, though not the sound of them as they popped. When placed in a fire and when he felt the knife cut his throat and the last of his blood flowed from the wound, he welcomed it. Sam's thoughts were that a dragon's flames would have been preferable to this.